There we go. I always hate doing introductions. I always feel so awkward with them.
Right. Okay.
But today we're going to be talking about St. John Fisher, a incredible saint, bishop, cardinal, and martyr, which, like myself, I think probably most Catholics know very little about him. Mm-hmm. There's very little I know about him.
There's a lot to know about him, though.
Yeah. Just recently, in preparing for this, I was reading from that one book that you sell on the life of John Fisher, but I could only get a cursory browse through it. Before we get into that, we were discussing earlier the other day about the name of the channel, Pipes with Augustine.
Right.
And how in the previous interview with Father Ripperger, a number of people were saying, oh, don't like the name, you need to change the name, you're just being a copycat and blah, 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 blah. And you brought up that one parable story about,
right.
You can't please everyone. If you try to, you just end up throwing your ass in the river.
Right. Yeah. Actually, the parable is so an old man and his son set out on a journey. So they pack the donkey and they get moving. And so they go through one town and the people say, the man's riding on the donkey, the son's leading it. And the people say, look at that mean old man making his son, walk while he rides all high and mighty on the donkey. And so then, they look at each other, they listen to their criticisms, they switch. And then the next town, then the son is sitting on the donkey and his father is leading the donkey, right? And so they say, well, look at that wicked son making his poor aged father drag this donkey, walk on foot, leading this donkey. So they look at each other and they walk, abreast, dragging the donkey along. And then the next town, people say, look at those characters, just mistreating that poor animal, leading it all their burdens and everything. So in the next town, after the next town, they throw the donkey in the river and go on. And so the moral of the story is, if you're going to listen to what everybody says, you might as well throw your ass in the river.
Exactly.
If you'd be allowed to be pronounced.
Yeah. So I really don't care about all the naysayers,
It'd be one thing if you said, pipes with Aquinas.
Yeah,
that would be far more obviously riffing.
The one thing I'm concerned about is I just wouldn't want Matt Fradd to be offended by it, which I don't think he would be. He doesn't seem to me like
he doesn't seem that kind of character.
No. I suppose if the majority of people felt that way, then that might be an issue. But let me know if you're someone who doesn't have an issue with the name and you like it, but you think it might be problematic, let me know in the comments. But sure, I can get the thing to stay lit.
I did just open it recently.
So the other negative comments I get is how terrible an interviewer I am and how unprepared I am. Well, all the previous interviews I have done, I have had prepared questions. Doesn't mean I'm a good interviewer. This one is the first one where I actually don't have many prepared questions. So how does that make you feel? I mean, what do you think about that?
Probably allowed me more time to blab, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the point of an interview is to ask questions that are relevant to the audience and basically to let the interviewer talk. So you see one person I'm critical of when he does interviews is, Alex Jones, popular media figure, right? And apart from anything else you might think about Alex Jones, whenever he has anybody on there, he's constantly talking over them, interrupting to kind of add in how awesome, he is. Why, I'm going to beat the globalists in the new world order. I'm doing this. And his interviewee has barely gotten really to say much, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, all your interviews in the past, it's you ask the question, you lay out a little background, and then they talk.
Right.
So, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's you're doing your job. So,
yeah. Well, we get into John Fisher. What I want to cover in this is one, get to know who John Fisher was. Why was he such a great saint? Because it's my understanding that other great heroic saints and bishop cardinals like St. Robert Bellarmine, Charles Borromeo, Francis de Sales, Alphonsus Liguori, these Titans, they looked to John Fisher as a role model. Even though they are role models, to them, John Fisher was a role model. So in a certain sense, I guess you could say John Fisher was like the role model of role models. But why? Like, I don't know. I don't really know much about him.
Right.
And, but then, so also getting to know who he was, but then making it a little bit more relevant by tying in how he can be such a good role model for our own times, for bishops and priests of our own times, and what are kind of the similarities between his days and our days. So that's kind of the dynamic I'd like to go with here. But I guess to kind of lead into that, if we look at our culture today throughout the world in the church, there's this kind of hyper attention to everything the Pope and bishops say. As soon as he says something, it's boom, it's all over Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and everything. And you've got extremes on both sides. Some who will, listen to everything he says and say, oh, everything he says you need to listen to and obey and everything. And then on the others will say, well, I'm not going to listen to anything he says. He's a heretic and blah, 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 blah. Instead of just kind of, in a certain sense, ignoring what he says and just live your Catholic life, live your faith day in and day out as you should. So maybe to kind of lead us in, give us this backdrop of the history of how did this hyper attention come about, this just always focusing on everything that the Pope and bishops say.
It really begins in the 19th century, and it begins from two causes. One, Napoleon and putting the Pope in jail, Pius VII. And Pius VII really becomes this cause célèbre in Europe because he resisted Napoleon. And so, his name now is kind of known everywhere. So there's even a sort of popularity to the papacy in a lot of places outside of Italy. Italy has its own problems. And so, various popes in between Pius VII and, say, Pius IX, and Pius IX himself, they have a lot of problems because of revolutions taking place in Italy. Because what happens under Napoleon is the French Revolution comes to Italy, and the Treaty of Paris, after Napoleon is exiled, more or less, and then again later, they give the Pope the papal territory back, the papal states, and people who were in power under the revolutionary framework of the French now are out of power, and they're not happy about it. And this gives, the groundwork, the seed work to various revolutionary movements, European Freemasonry, other things that look to create a new state. And the state is militant. When it does create in 1870, it's militantly anti-Catholic. It is very hostile to the Pope. And Pius IX is kind of like a hero, like a folk hero in a lot of places because of his resistance to a lot of these movements amongst conservatives. And then you have the Vatican Council. And that occurs the very first ecumenical council when there's an institution that we now call the media. Back in those days, you call it the press. That didn't exist before. And so they're covering and also distorting a lot of what's actually going on, the issue of the papal infallibility, which I don't know if I want to broach that here, but that gets broached in the press. And you have, Dullinger and Dom Guéranger fighting it out in theological journals or that are getting now quoted in newspapers talking about papal infallibility, with the press clearly taking Dullinger's side against papal infallibility and then completely mischaracterizing what that is. And then because of that, the misunderstanding of so much with papal infallibility, and that the average, theologians understand the distinctions that, infallibility is only invoked under these conditions specifically, either as a solemn judgment or even ordinary teaching may be infallible under these conditions, but not just because he said them. Not just because, I'm sorry, but every papal bowel movement is not an act of infallibility. It's not an act of the Holy Spirit. I'm sorry. I just did use an absurd example to illustrate the absurdity of the view, but people have kind of taken that view, especially in modern times. That seems to be, although it was like nothing a pope said was infallible to a certain class of people. When, say, John Paul II was saying that no, you can't have women's ordination. Ordinatio sacerdotales comes out. Yeah, you don't have to listen to that. Pope Francis says something, and the liberals like it. Oh no, you absolutely have to believe this, or you're schismatic. Now that the shoe's on the other foot.
Right.
So you have these kind of things, but so it's really the arrival of the media in the 19th century, right at the time that you have the Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council, that is really what kind of starts focusing that attention. And then the popes start using the press. Pius X, who's a very popular pope in this country especially, and that's because of Cardinal Gibbons, whatever else you want to say about Cardinal Gibbons. He actually convinced Cardinal Sarto to accept the papacy, and he didn't want to. And Pius, as Pius X, he used the press to communicate the Catholic message to the world. And you have the Vatican is a huge political force. And so people are paying attention. And then leading up into, Vatican II. So now, as everything else in society polarizes, which the media, again, has a big, force in doing, you have everything the Pope says is still of importance to the people who want to use that one way or the other. So, you could argue whether, and this is a question beyond the question whether it's right or wrong. This is just the fact of it. Conservatives in this country especially, but also in other countries in Europe, seizing upon John Paul II's teaching on various life and moral issues and making the entire pontificate out to be like that and of these things to push their specific agenda. While at the same time, you have people who are more on the left who will pick out these things the Pope says, because it's serving, and they do that with everything, because everything is so polarized between right and left, and as the Overton window continues to shift or not, based on, and that's a whole model of revolution since the French Revolution, right? You have your radicals, and then you have a group that's even more radical than them. So the old conservatives now become the far right. The new conservatives are the old liberals, and the radicals now are pushing the Overton windowing as well, so it keeps shifting, and the position shifts. So that Danton is staunch revolutionary, is now declared counter-revolutionary and killed as that Overton window shifts, right, by the Directory. So, and that's just an example, and that's exactly, and it is a Marxist movement, ultimately. And the birth of communism is in the French Revolution. Right. And so what we're seeing is that is the character of modernity, period, in the West, I should say. Not making any judgments about the Asian thinking of things from whatever culture you want to get into. In the West, that's how the world has now been reframed. So that's why, again, everything that, with the hyper attention of the media, anything a pope says is going to be important for that reason. But in the 16th century, that's not the case. Whatever the Pope is saying about something is largely the provenance of canonists and secondarily theologians, because most of the time the Pope's putting it's going to be some canon law document. We ratify, under the curse of Saints Peter and Paul, that valid now and in perpetuity that the papal notary shall be 15. There's documents like that. There's tons of them, because it's a canonical language that's employed to say, and so canonists largely are dealing with what the Pope is saying. And then theologians too. So if there's a council, if there's a major document, so for example, when Leo X publishes Exsurge Domine against Luther, and now theologians are going to be studying this and reading this and working this out. Most of this doesn't really touch the average person in, say, some village in England, or John Fisher's diocese in Rochester. They're laboring away at their trades or in their farms, and they're going to mass, and they're seeking alms from the church. They're trying to pay their taxes. They're trying to do all these sorts of things, and they go to mass and they hear preaching. Until Fisher got there, they heard preaching maybe in Advent and Lent, whereas Fisher's having preaching all the time, and he preaches in person, which is extremely rare, but that's what they're getting.
So you preaching in person versus what was the other way?
The other way,
sending out letters.
The other way is that you hit around at court looking for royal favor. You went to Rome looking for favors from someone in Rome to get a better job and get a lot of income. And you'd pay some priest to manage your diocese, and he's just squabbling to keep the money around to pay for necessary things. Well, he sends the rest either at court or in Rome. And and then the average priest is just kind of doing his best, feeling unsupported. That's called episcopal absenteeism. And it is one of the big scourges of the 16th century. It's one of the biggest things that the Council of Trent was trying to deal with. So it's an entirely different world in that respect. And so and it's not just because of papal infallibility, it's largely because of international media. Mm-hmm. So John Fisher's time, he's a boy, he was the son of a mercer and, a wool merchant near York in a town called Beverly. And they were famous for dyeing blue. So he used to talk about Beverly blue and things like that. So a lot of dyes like that. And so they were a very profitable town. So during the Wars of the Roses, they're more or less left alone. And so Fisher, shows himself to be very brilliant. And his father died, his mother remarried, and there was a lot of, good amount of wealth. So because he was so brilliant in the local grammar schools, they sent him to Cambridge. So now in the grammar schools, you start kind of the rudimentary courses that are more formalized at university, which is the trivium, which is grammar, which is Latin grammar, not English grammar. So you become, you learn Latin, so you learn how to speak. Then you learn logic, you learn how to speak correctly, and you learn rhetoric, which is how to sound good while doing the other two. Just to put it out there in that way, So, and he was brilliant in all these things. So they decided to send him to Cambridge, which was a recovering university from, the problem of lack of funding, lack of resources and things like that. And so he, again, becomes this academic superstar, just with his utter brilliance in all of the, take his degrees young all the time. He's ordained at 23, so just before the customary age.
Yeah, so Cambridge and Oxford at the time weren't they were kind of I don't know if in shambles isn't maybe not quite the right word, but they were suffering a lot because of the wars that were
the wars, the lack of scholars. And so Cambridge was at a point they needed to hire an Italian to compose a valedictory oration in Latin because they couldn't do it. They didn't have anyone sufficiently able to do it themselves at a certain point. So that's how bad it had gotten. And
now, at a university like that at Cambridge, is that where they would study the quadrivium?
Mm-hmm. You get the rudiments of it in a grammar school, but this is where you get it formalized. And then you have a career opportunity. You're either going to go into law, which means you're going to go to you're doing a course like St. Thomas More did. Mm-hmm. And Thomas More didn't even spend that much time at Oxford. He mostly just went straight through the law courts and the various inns and whatnot. So you either go into law, or you're going to go into, or diplomatic service or whatnot, or you're going to go into the church. Those are your two career paths for success. Sometimes you get away as a private person. So Erasmus of Rotterdam is a good friend of Fisher and More. He's a complicated figure and probably it depends how much time we want to go in if I want to talk about him at length. But so Erasmus of Rotterdam, it becomes kind of a self-made man because he is brilliant in Latin. And his whole thing is, you might call him kind of the predecessor to what they call today in French, ressourcement, the ressourcement theologians that everyone's so enamored with right now. And he does rather the same thing they do. It's just used going back to the sources as a cover for trying to innovate and subvert, things they dislike in theology or whatnot without actually engaging the other side by pretending it all goes back to the sources. Mm-hmm. And this is very much what de Lubac does. This is very much and so that's also what Erasmus does. And to a great extent, but because he learns the Latin so well and he gets royal patronage, in terms of funding and whatnot, he's able to kind of go it alone without being attached specifically to the service of a king, or he gets the money.
Talking about Erasmus.
Erasmus, yeah. And so he's, largely independent, but he always needs money. So he was always looking around for new patrons. This is why eventually he comes to England and he enters More Circle around 1504 or so.
Because he was from Netherlands, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he was also a Greek scholar too, wasn't he?
He was a Greek scholar. He was pioneering, Greek. He did something interesting, which was to take the New Testament in Greek and translate it into Latin, like literally. And so to give people who didn't know Greek the benefit of getting an insight into how the Greek reads and how it goes. It was called the Novum Instrumentum, or the new organ, the new instrument for scripture studies, basically. And it was meant, again, excuse me, it was meant, again, to be kind of like this, going back to the sources. And what that means is going back to like Italian humanists like Lorenzo Valla, who are questioning the church's entire system of penance, right? Because, look, in the Greek, it doesn't, the Latin says penitemini, go do penance, but the Greek, it just means turn your life around. It doesn't mean do penance like the church means.
Right.
And so that would be the argument that they would use. Erasmus actually makes a note of that when he invades against various system of penances and whatnot in the church. And Luther will pick up on that too in his own writing against indulgences. But anyways, so Fisher, on the other hand, doesn't go that route, but he is extremely well studied in the sources. And even he'll be good friends with Erasmus, but not go in the direction that Erasmus does, questioning the papacy, questioning various systems of the church, throwing out the scholastics. Fisher is actually proficient both in the church fathers and the scholastics. Mm-hmm. He has a brilliant education. He's an academic superstar. And he becomes one of the big figures in the administration of Cambridge. And he's also recruiting scholars to teach there. He's also part of the whole educational framework that makes Cambridge. And now they're actually producing, historians are actually going back and reevaluating and appreciating more Fisher's role in the history of Cambridge, which is a newer thing that, it's been in the works for a while, but more historians are paying attention to it, so it's starting to proliferate more. Whereas Fisher typically, he's the one guy, that stick in the mud that just wouldn't go along with Henry VIII, and they killed him. Largely, Fisher is basically liquidated from history, and we'll see how that goes in the course of the events with Henry VIII. But More survives, because More, is a layman, and he's easier to secularize from the English side of the English history writers, because he's like this road bump on the path to Reformation. But Fisher, not only is he a bishop, but he's a reforming bishop. He's doing all the things the Reformation says it's going to do, but doesn't do. And so he's a hard one. He's not like some corrupt bishop you just go after because, look at all this stuff he did. They don't have that on him. So they just have to liquidate him.
Would you say with Fisher, perhaps one of the things that stands out about him, I don't know, but I assume that one of the things that might stand out about him, among others of his time, is that he's not just this great scholar who knows a lot, but actually lives the faith, who lives what he learns.
Right. That's true. Even on the side of great theologians who are great theologians, there's no history of their lives, showing like a deep abiding holiness like you do. It's like Bellarmine's an example, again, joining those two together. Borromeo also. And with Bellarmine, you see clear signs of transforming union in his later life. And in Fisher, you don't quite see that, but you do see the deep fidelity to holiness in every contemporary account, as well as later accounts. They all agree in his penances, his practices of charity, his almsgiving, the times he would retire for prayer, the devotion he had to his diocese as a bishop, which is absolutely unique among bishops of that time. You just don't see that hardly anywhere, with only a handful of exceptions. So it's and that's why he becomes this great model. But I guess going back to his life, though, he is this superstar at Cambridge, and then he comes to the notice of the Queen Mother, that is Lady Margaret Beaufort. So I don't know. I'm not going to go through all the War of the Roses.
Yeah, that's so complicated.
Henry VII is the victor of Bosworth, and of course he has a very tenuous claim to the throne. And the Beauforts were legitimized by Act of Parliament, but they descend from John of Gaunt's third. Eventually wife, but at the time mistress, who Catherine Swinson, and they eventually marry, but the line that produces the Beauforts they're bastardized, and so they have to get legitimized by Parliament because they were born out of wedlock, and whereas the Yorkist house, they descend from John of Gaunt's first marriage. And so they were seen as more legitimate. So there's all these problems with the throne, and Henry's putting out rebellions because there's a lot of them. It's not, that are being sponsored because, if someone with a weak claim like Henry the Tudor can get the throne, anyone can. That's why you see like a Perkin Warbeck, like I can't remember the other pretended to be one of the princes of the Tower or whatnot, that rise up to try to take the throne. So in the midst of, after Henry's kind of put a lot of that down, Lady Margaret Beaufort receives a deputation from Cambridge to settle disputes between the university and the local town of Cambridge, which happens frequently enough. Property, students misbehaving, whatever in the town tries to revoke various privileges of the university. So they're looking for royal support. And Fisher, dines with the Queen Mother, and she's very impressed with him. He's just a priest at this point. So it's within a short amount of time that she again meets with him, and she makes him her confessor. So that he's now the confessor to the Queen Mother. And then that's the very point where all of a sudden the Henry VII starts paying attention to Cambridge, and he starts getting royal favor, he gets attention. And Fisher then becomes the point man, and he's just elected to higher offices, chancellorship, whatever, because even though he's super young, because he's got the connection, because
he's the confessor to the Queen Mother.
Queen Mother. And then there's another bit too. So Henry VII wanted to change his confessor, because his confessor is an observant Franciscan. And I forget all there's a protocol for royalty and their confessors. And so they can't just change their confessor because they don't like him. They have a confessor assigned to him, and you have to go to the Pope. And so he gets the English agent in Rome, Cardinal Castiglione, to go to, I believe it was Julius II at the time. I could be wrong. It might actually have been Alexander, but I think it was Julius II. And he says, the King of England, he wants to change his confessor, because the observant Franciscans, the same order of St. Bernardine of Siena, St. John Capistrano, very, very devoted to the rule of St. Francis, very fervent. Secular historians call them frenzied, right? Because they don't understand the fervency of their life. And, so Henry VII's looking for a change, and the Pope says it's absolutely impossible. Can't do that. And now, so
if it was Julius II, is that the same Julius that was with Michelangelo? And
yes, same one. Same time frame.
Military guy.
Yep. Yeah, the one who took his name not after Pope Julius I, the early Pope and martyr, but after Julius Caesar. And he was a bold man. And about the only person in temper, in fiery temper, that could match him was Michelangelo. So Michelangelo wasn't afraid to stand up to him. So they'd get shouting matches, because Michelangelo knew that the Pope needed him more than the other way around. So
this is all the same time period then.
Pretty much, give or take a few years or so. But so now the Pope had a relative that he wanted to be made a Knight of the Garter, which is an English title, and Castiglione said absolutely impossible, because that's only given out to only a few relations that are in other households. Otherwise, it's only Englishmen. So they do a deal. The Pope's relative could be made a Knight of the Garter, even though he speaks no English or French. And Henry VII can change his confessor, which is a Frenchman named Baron. I can't remember his first name, but Baron, essentially, Baron. And so he becomes now the king's new chaplain. And so Henry VII wants him, to get sufficient honor. So he asked Fisher to help get him a certain amount of honor. So Fisher, it's very modern the way he does this, gives him an honorary doctorate. And it shows actually the notes for this occasion when he comes to preach. Everyone is ordered to be there.
Was that basically a novelty? Like that was that something that was like never done before?
It was done, but you could do it. Would be usually be to accommodate royalty, like in this case. And Fisher does it with the plum, gives him the honorary doctorate. But he and Baron actually work very closely together. Fisher is one of the reasons why we know what we know about Henry VII, because he prepares all the work for basically giving the life of Henry VII. And so, although it's given, with pro-Tudor slant and all the things, but he furnishes almost all of these documents to Polydore Virgil, who's an Italian humanist living in Italy, and living in England, and he writes all these accounts of Henry VII, largely because Fisher supplied them. So Fisher becomes this big figure at court, and he basically, directs Lady Margaret Beaufort so that she becomes a saint. She spends all her day in religion and prayer. She translates sections of the Imitation of Christ out of French for exercises. She patronizes learning, printing.
Was Imitation of Christ originally written?
It was originally in Latin, but she had a French copy that she used. And so it's part of her devotions doing that. And also you have to keep in mind, Henry VII is the first monarch to sit on the English throne that at least where French wasn't his first language, where he actually speaks English.
Oh,
And
wow.
English is the language of court.
I didn't realize
that wasn't true, because you go back to the Norman conquest, and Normal, they're all French. The Anglo-French becomes a big fixture of the court.
So Henry V?
Henry V, they spoke that line in the last act of Henry V in Shakespeare, where he can't talk to Princess Catherine because she speaks French. It's total bubkiss, but Shakespeare had no way to know that.
Sure.
Namely that, because French was Henry V's first language. Even though it was a dialect, it was Anglo-French, but they would have understood each other perfectly well.
That's funny.
And so, it's but Henry V is also the first English monarch that learns English as a second language, but the language of court and law and everything else is still Anglo-Norman French. And that kind of continues for a long time. And so Henry VII now his first language was Welsh. And he would have spoken French probably as a second language because he was exiled in Brittany for so long. But he would have had to learn it when he came back. But he did, and he made that, even though that was like a third language for him, he makes that the language of court. And so the only place for Anglo-Norman French after that as it develops is in the law courts. So, like, if you read the Lives of St. Thomas More, you'll read that he spent a lot of time lecturing in law French. And law French is, again, the same Anglo-Norman French. Anything done in Star Chamber is done in Anglo-Norman French. We still have echoes of that, actually, in the U.S. Court system, where when the Supreme Court opens, I'm not sure about other courts, but I know when the Supreme Court opens, they say, "Oyez, oyez, oyez." It's spelled O-Y-E-Z. It's like, what's this oyez stuff? It's Anglo-Norman French. Hear ye, hear ye.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's why, and it's a callback to the
So the U.S. Supreme Court does that.
Yeah. Because when the founders established everything, they're still modeling everything off of England. And so it's a revolution that basically preserves the English Revolution of 1688 over here instead for a new elite running it instead of the monarch and parliament. So, but it's all the same. It's all exactly the same thing. You have, in Congress, you have two houses of Congress. You have the House of Representatives, which is like the House of Commons. You have the Senate, which is like the House of Lords. And that's why the Senate was originally meant to be an aristocratic institution like the House of Lords. It was a state legislature that appointed your senators, not a direct vote from the people. The executive was basically a king, and he was, but for 4 years or 8. And of course, he has pretty much the same powers as the king. Now, more power than the English king had had in a generation, right? But that's the reality. You look at even inaugurations; it's a secular coronation. It is a copy of the English government that they knew when they established all these things after the revolution. So it's, but that's why there's all these kind of callbacks to that. So Henry VII starts noting the holiness of John Fisher and even the change in his own mother and how she's advanced in holiness and spirituality. So he decides he's going to make good a lot of bad that he's done. And he did a lot of bad. And to keep down the Yorkists, he had to use crushing taxation. He has these two court officials, Empson and Dudley, who are malicious in their prosecution of various nobility for any slight hint of disloyalty. Go and confiscate as much as they can confiscate, put people in jail for any particular reason that they want to. And actually, it's Biron and the king's new confessor and John Fisher that work together with different parts of the court to try to oust Empson and Dudley. Because for Fisher, we need to save the king's soul. That's the angle he comes at it. And so, but anyway, that happens a little later. In the meantime, Henry VII, he notices Fisher. He notices how holy he is. And he says, this man needs to be a bishop. And I need more bishops like this. So he makes him the Bishop of Rochester, which was the smallest diocese and is meant to be the stepping stone to greater ones. And it's probably what he intended for Fisher to have greater roles, except what happens in the next reign, he doesn't quite get those. But, before he could appoint new bishops, he dies. And then, Fisher and working with Biron.
If I can interrupt there.
Oh, yeah.
So the king, this is before the English Reformation or Revolution. So this is still when England is Catholic. And the king is appointing bishops rather than the Pope. So
this has been the practice for, you have all the crises of lay investiture and all these sorts of things. But in reality, the problem in the Middle Ages is the state encroaching upon the church. And that creates at least 3/4 of the evils that are there leading up to the Reformation. And so
when did that kind of practice start to take place with the kings and whatnot appointing bishops?
It's hard to say, but it had become customary since at least the 14th century. That the king wants this guy to be bishop, and he goes, the Pope appoints him after the king has nominated him. And the papacy, especially during the Renaissance, gets so corrupt that they don't even bother inquiring into the qualifications. If king wants him, he gets it as long as they get the Anates tax, the first year of income from that diocese, sent to Rome, because they need it for funding all sorts of things and building Rome as this great Renaissance city. They're not particularly worried about the spiritual good of the church. The popes have become these Italian potentates. And then, of course, it's when the French come to Italy during the Italian Wars, those complicated politics and armies, and Alexander VI, first he fights the French, and then he decides, oh wait, I'm going to get richer if I join with them. And so he marries his nephew Cesare, who's falsely said to be his son, into the French royal family, and so many other things. And he needs lots of money. So whatever guy you want to be the bishop, as long as the Pope gets the first year of income, the Anates tax, it doesn't matter. So Henry VII's like, we're going to change this. And that's why, too, you get so many guys who are not there by their qualifications, but because the king thinks they're useful. And instead of managing the church, which they may not be suited to, even though they did take degrees in theology and they, whatnot, they're going to be hanging around court looking for favors, looking for handouts, looking for money. I mean, in England, you have that anyway with the House of Lords. Bishops, by being a bishop, you are part of the House of Lords because you're an ecclesiastical lord. Right. And so Fisher, apart from all his other duties in his diocese, he has to, when Parliament opens, he's got to go show up in the House of Lords. Convocation, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, or later Cardinal Wolsey, is establishing convocations, basically sort of like a bishop's conference, but except it's not like a formalized institution. It's rather just a synod, basically, countrywide. All the bishops go to. Fisher's got to stop what he's doing and go to that. And usually that's, Wolsey demanding more money so the king can go fight in wherever, in Europe or something. So Henry VII dies, and Henry VIII, just barely, 18, comes to the throne in 1509. And so Henry he solves all of the problems that there were, like, for example, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That was decided upon as early as when Arthur was buried in the ground. But Henry VII is thinking, the Spanish alliance didn't really do much for me, so maybe I should look abroad. Maybe we will. And then, he keeps negotiating for better deals out of Ferdinand of Aragon for, bigger dowry, more money, more Spanish help, and this sort of thing. And then he's looking to the French. He's looking to, for whatever and Catherine's status is in question. Henry solves all of that in weeks and marries Catherine for love. Then there's the matter of Margaret Beaufort dies shortly after the coronation, and she leaves John Fisher a huge sum of money in order to found ecclesiastical institutions, to train priests for preaching, to improve the understanding of theology, to improve the finances of local parish priests so that they can be better priests and whatnot.
So they can give regular sermons rather than once or twice a year.
And not just that too, but that to build an actual institution for training priests, and that's St. John's College, Cambridge, which is there now. And Fisher was the principal person building that. Well, Henry VIII needed all of his grandmother's money because he's doling it out to his friends. Henry VIII, growing up, became friends with all the Yorkists at the tilt yards, right? He wasn't allowed to joust himself because once his brother was dead, but he still needed, he was making, these are all his friends. The equivalent term today would be your locker room buddies, right?
Yes.
And so there's no revolution against Henry. There's no, revolt. He's very popular. And the Yorkists are like, well, he does descend from us on his mother's side, Elizabeth of York. So they're happy. And now he's doling out money to all his friends. He's parties, and he runs out of money very quickly. And so he needs to do something. So he and Fisher get in a protracted battle in the courts. And they have to come to an agreement where Fisher has to let a part of it go. And, and then Henry avoids the embarrassment of fighting this out in court because the terms of her will were very, very clear. And so, but Henry was not happy with Fisher because of that. So Fisher is still in court as an almoner because he gets mostly the privy council of his father, Bishop Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bishop Fox of Winchester. And so Fisher's attached to them. He doesn't have any kind of formal particular role, and he's mostly working in his diocese, and he's fine with that, actually. He's perfectly happy managing the affairs of his diocese, and that's largely what he ends up doing. And he's still tapped to be a confessor to Queen Catherine at various times, and again because of his holiness. But he's mostly in his diocese working with his people, and you see there. You have, even today, you can get it from Mediatrix Press, I believe, a modernized English edition of his penitential psalms, which are fantastic. And these are psalms.
Commentary on them?
Commentary on them. They're sermons, and they are. They were given to the people outside of Mass because their length, they're far too long. Might have been even given in sessions, and the notes later put together and published. But they, he would ride out on his horse, and the people would assemble to listen, and he would preach to them. And so, somebody even said, "My Lord, why do you preach to the people instead of sending it to the priest as other bishops do?" And he said, according to the early biographer of Fisher, he says, "If I preach not to the people, I shall be damned," because that's his apostolic mission as a bishop. And so whatever about questions of theology, he had his own special room at Cambridge with all their texts of the fathers, and he would read these and he'd study them, pore over them. But he never neglected his duty to his diocese and to his people. And so he's always there. He's always distributing alms. He would sit outside, dealing with like legal things. He's still the Chancellor of Cambridge, and he's managing all of his duties in so many different places. It's amazing the amount of work that he was able to accomplish.
Yeah. So he's obviously an incredibly influential bishop. He's got all these high perks, being confessor to the Queen Mother and all this, and chancellor and master of the Cambridge and whatnot. And he, of course, the Queen Mother endows him with all this money and everything, but yet he himself lives extremely poorly. Oh yeah, doesn't he? And
we know this because he was attainted during some of the business that goes down during the king's great matter, as it were. And so Cromwell's men go through his house, and they make a catalog of all of his things, of his possessions. And so everything is described with the adjective as old, except for the accommodations for his servants or whatnot. They have new and up-to-date stuff, but his bed was in the exact same condition as he inherited it 30 years earlier when he became the bishop in Rochester. They say a silk, old, various devices for creating different medicines, which today we call homeopathics. They're for distilling various herbs to bring them, they're poisonous, to bring them down to a certain level. According to various books of herb lore that he had, almost, every single thing he had was old. That bed would have been torturous to sleep on. Nothing precious in his own residence or room. The only thing that was decorated nicely was the chapel, upon which he has St. John's head, which is an image of St. John the Baptist beheaded. And it was a popular thing in medieval piety. So he had that, and that's what they catalog. And then they found the safe in the Episcopal Palace, and they couldn't get into it. And so they say, okay, now this is where the old bishops got the money hidden, right? So they bring in several locksmiths to try to get into it. And when they finally get it open, they find a whip and a hair shirt. That's what was locked up in the safe. And it's in the official reports. These are still state documents that you can get, that you can read. I'm not sure if they're online, but I know they have them. I've seen the transcription of them in various books, but I don't believe they have them online where you can view them. But yeah, that's the official state paper record of what was in Fisher's residence. And so he gave everything he could to his people. He kept nothing for himself. And being in such a high position of power under Henry VII, to being reduced to completely outside of court influence, except in a couple of things under Henry VIII, there's not a word of complaint. He's not mad. He's not seeking favor. He's like the complete opposite of Wolsey, who's always looking for higher and higher favor, when he can get it. So
yeah, here's one of the books that you published through your Mediatrix Press. Now, this was this written in English?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just a reprint.
It's a reprint.
Okay.
Father McNabb.
Yeah, written by Father Vincent McNabb. On the back, there's this quote of St. John Fisher about this his view of the finances and whatnot, where he says, quote, "Truly, it was a more glorious sight to see St. Paul, who got his living by his own great labor in hunger, thirst, watchings, in cold, going wool-clad and bearing about the gospel and law of Christ, both upon the land and the sea, than to behold now the archbishops and bishops in their apparel, be it never so rich. In that time were no chalices of gold, but there were many golden priests. Now be many chalices of gold, and almost no golden priests. Truly, neither gold, precious stones, nor glorious bodily garments be not the cause wherefore kings and princes of the world should dread God and his church. For doubtless they have far more worldly riches than we have. But holy doctrine, good life, and example of honest conversation be the occasion whereby good and holy men, also wicked and cruel people, are moved to the love and fear Almighty God." End quote. St. John Fisher.
And he wasn't above criticizing corruption in the church amongst clergy and even Rome itself. And so there's a Lutheran named Valenus, and he was a Moravian. So he wrote a book trying to argue that Peter never went to Rome. Therefore, Peter has no successors. And so Fisher, writes against the book. And in one of the chapters, Valenus brings up, but in Rome, there's never fasting and there's never penance, and the priests go about in their finery, and the Pope has these great feasts. Nobody fasts. Nobody keeps the customary fasts. Nobody's doing alms and works of mercy, but everything's looking for worldly glory and building this up. And then Fisher stops and says, but this goes to prove the very thing we've been saying. For all the other patriarchal sees have been given over to heretics or destroyed by infidels, but this one see has lasted, even though it has deserved the same fate 100 times over. Now, today, there's a whole class of people on the internet and on Twitter that would call him schismatic for saying something like that.
How dare he?
How dare he? And so he, but that was, it really succinctly gives his view on the corruption of the day versus what should be doing. And so, and he never wavered from that in his really holy life. So he's kind of out of prominence again, except to being an irritation for Cardinal Wolsey when Wolsey's trying to raise new taxes and tax the church, because Henry VIII comes to the throne with an idea of reinventing the entire monarchy, of revisualizing it all, not for the Reformation. That's reading it backwards. To emulate his hero, Henry V, and restart the 100 Years' War in France. And he does so as a crusader for the Pope against the King of France, because the King of France, Louis XII, he has organized a schismatic council in Italy to try to depose Julius II and put up an anti-pope. And so he's been excommunicated, and there's a holy league against France. And Henry now fights under a papal banner to fight against the French, and in which he's largely successful for a while. England just doesn't have the finances and the money to keep armies in the field perpetually. So, after they exhaust themselves and tax the church and everything, they have to say, all right, we got to find a way to get glory another way. Plus, then you get Francois I comes to the throne after Louis the 12th, and he calls Henry's bluff essentially and says, well, yes, Henry declared, if we say whether the King of France will go to Italy or whether he won't, because my armies are up here in northern France. And Francois I, Count of Angoulême, unites so many disparate parts of the French nobility under him, says, all right, I'm going to Italy, Henry, try to stop me. And he ends up working out a deal with Julius II, ends the whole thing. Henry's like, all right, this guy, he's younger than I am, and he's also a Renaissance king. He's going to outclass me. I got to do something. And so that brings in the peace conference, the Field of the Cloth of Gold, as it's called, largely forgotten about thing in history, where Henry and Wolsey, they organize this peace conference, and they go in this sumptuous field in Picardy full of tents that are made of cloth of gold and games, jousts, all these things. Henry has to spoil it all by challenging Francois I to a wrestling match, which he loses.
Henry loses?
Henry loses because Francois was about 6 inches taller. So even though Henry was pretty tall himself. But in a great sumptuous occasion, John Fisher was there. It's the only time he's known to have left England. And but he was there as Catherine of Aragon's counselor. So Henry and Francois, they declare perpetual peace, and the Venetian ambassador Giustiniani, he observes this and he says, peace? These two men hate each other. There's not going to be perpetual peace. And sure enough, just a few days later, Henry VIII, Thomas More, and Wolsey, and Richard Pace, they all meet with Charles V and his ambassadors to declare war in France the next year.
Wow.
So just the politics of time. But Henry is a crusader for the Pope against the French. And then again, he takes on that banner when Luther appears. And Henry was extremely well informed of what was going on in Germany because there was an English humanist, later Bishop of Durham, Cuthbert Tunstall. And he was present at the Diet of Worms and giving Henry more or less the play-by-play and what Luther had taught, and forwarded copies of Luther's book, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, where Luther attacks the sacraments, the seven sacraments, and tries to argue that there were in the first draft he writes that where he says there's three: baptism, penance, and the bread, i.e. the Eucharist. But then he changes his mind, decides penance isn't a sacrament, and so baptism and Eucharist are the only sacraments.
But he doesn't believe in transubstantiation. Then.
He's rejected that too at this point, at the time the book's written. So Henry sees this, and now this is a way to make a mark on the church. Now, Henry is also one of the very best educated monarchs to sit on the English throne. So at least since Alfred the Great. And he's given this brilliant Renaissance education in the new learning and from all the great humanists. He speaks Latin and Spanish, French extremely well, Italian also. He's been given a great, and because his older brother was supposed to be king. So Arthur gets the medieval king's education, and Henry is raised largely by women, with women, his mother and his sisters. And he always has this need for women and romance and everything, stuff that normally a king would be isolated and sent off to Ludlow Castle over in Wales. And that's where he'd be trained in a medieval notion of kingship. Instead, he gets this Renaissance education. He's also fairly well trained in theology and whatnot. And he considered himself no mean theologian, even though really...
And a musician too, right?
And a musician, yeah. Actually, he wrote some wonderful compositions in musical chant too. Pastime with Good Company, you can Google that and find some good renditions of that. He wrote that. And we know he wrote it too, because in terms of the musicology of the period, there's actually a mistake in there. So a courtier would never have allowed that to stay, but because Henry did it, Robert ignores it. But beside that, so he feels he's properly equipped to write a response to Luther. And so he does, with help. He does have, including consultation from John Fisher, but it's very clearly Henry's work. There's a tradition.
Is this what is called the defense of the Catholic faith, whatever?
The defense of the seven sacraments.
Okay.
And so the longer, the title in Latin is a lot longer, defense of the seven sacraments against the writings of Martin Luther.
The same work that, at least in the play and the film, A Man for All Seasons, they try to say, Thomas More, oh, you wrote this book for him.
Right. Well, because they did that. So there's some people that go around that thinking, oh, well, Fisher actually wrote that book. And that actually comes from a tradition that from Henry's own propaganda, because it was a feather in his cap that he wrote this book in 1523. But in 1535, it's a bit of an embarrassment. So first they try to lay it on More, and when More is in the tower, and More says, I have correspondence that can clearly show, because what actually happened is More was like a secretary, kind of putting all the papers together, notes and advice from various theological consultors like Fisher, like Tunstall, like a few others, other notes that were put together in Henry's writing, getting it all in order so that Henry could publish a coherent, narrative. And it is very much Henry's own writing, you can tell. When you read Fisher in Latin and you read Henry in Latin, you can tell that the method of constructing arguments are different. It's clearly the work of a very learned lay theologian and not the work of a professional theologian. You can tell the difference. If you know, you know. And so just judging by the Latin of it. Fisher certainly had input, and Henry definitely had him there. The notes show that Fisher was present, furnishing arguments for various church fathers that Henry almost certainly never read and whatnot. But ultimately, the work really is Henry's. So, but that's an embarrassment in 1535, because in the preamble to the whole thing, he attacks Luther for having attacked the Pope, and declares that the Pope truly is, the head of the universal church, and only a monster would attack the Pope the way Luther does. And in 1535, Henry's doing the exact same thing. So this looks really bad. Now, More actually suggested to Henry that Henry should leave that part out. And Henry says, well, why? And More, reminds him, well, there are, certain English laws about accepting the Pope's authority in civil matters, and the Pope's a lord just as you are, and what happens if you and he come to blows? And Henry says, well, even then I should still want it in here. And ultimately what More was getting at is that More at the time was following the opinion of his friend Erasmus, that the papacy was a human institution, not a divine one. And it was only through reading Fisher and reading Fisher's theological writing against Luther that it became clear to More that the papacy was not this human institution, that the way the Renaissance humanism was looking at it, it actually was a divine institution founded by Christ. And so he's kind of flabbergasted, and he reverses himself. Henry, on the other hand, goes the other way because of lust. So it became convenient to do so. So now we needed to lay the blame for this at somebody's feet. So first he tries More. More reminds Cromwell of this conversation with Henry and adds that he can prove it, with even a letter from the king himself to this effect. Then as they try to, after Fisher's beheaded, they try to blame Fisher for it. And the Henry's propaganda was so effective that with the Antwerp editors in 1593, when they're putting together all of Fisher's works, they were legitimately confused as to whether Fisher had written Henry's book, and the Seven Sacraments, or whether Henry had wrote it. So they just included it in there anyway, for the sake of it. So that's led to the kind of the confusion in modern days, where people think that Fisher actually wrote it, but it's because Henry needed to cast off the blame onto somebody else.
But now, Fisher, didn't he wrote some scathing arguments against Luther, did he not?
Oh, yes. And so, we're getting to that. So I should probably backtrack a bit to Luther. I had to let this go out. It was unfortunate. It was blabbing too long. Here we go. So Luther starts out, everyone knows the story, the lightning storm. He promises to be a monk if St. Anne saves him and all that stuff. Everyone should know the story. It's probably false, but nevertheless, it's what we got. And he enters a monastery, becomes a priest, and he starts, he's very brilliant, and he becomes, very, very scholarly in Greek and in Hebrew also. Although how well he knew the Hebrew is something that Hebraeus is of question. But anyway, he knew more about it than most of his interlocutors did, we'll put it that way. So, as he's learning all these things, so he's, tasked by the Augustinians to teach on Romans at the University of Erfurt. And he does so in 1512. It was only discovered, in the late 19th century, Luther's lecture notes. And what they show is in 1512, 5 years before anything on indulgences or anything else, he's already teaching faith alone. He's already teaching against free will. He's already teaching, questioning the sacraments. And it's in all his lecture notes on Romans. And so he's already there and further developing the heresies that he'll be known for much later. So the indulgences controversy largely become an excuse for Luther to use the abuses in the church to push more his heresies, and which he means to do as a Catholic, and that this is everyone will accept this, and this will be accepted as right, at least at first. So the indulgence controversy comes in. Now, what is an indulgence? A lot of people get mixed up on what an indulgence actually is. Mm-hmm. An indulgence is essentially it's a remission of temporal punishment due to sin. It is not a remission of sin. So you can't get your sins forgiven by paying a priest for an indulgence. You can't get your sins forgiven by doing an indulgence prayer out of a prayer book today. No theology in the church ever taught that. And also, you look at an indulgence and like in an indulgence prayer, right? It'll say, pray this 300 days. Woohoo, 300 days off purgatory. That's not what it means. It means the value of saying that prayer 300 times with faith and charity and love of God, that the value of doing that, will be added more or less to the church's spiritual treasury. Not that you specifically are getting 300 days off purgatory. It's for having done this prayer for 300 days. You get that value for having done it once, in as much as these spiritual, realities can be quantified. And so because these are all in the temporal administration of the church that come flowing from the heart of Christ, and when he says to whatever you shall bind on earth is bound in heaven, whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, freed up. This is in the temporal sphere, the punishment due to sin, right? So that's what an indulgence is. Now, everyone knows the rest. The popes needed money. They needed to pay Michelangelo. They needed to pay Raphael. Right. They needed to pay rebuilding St. Peter's, which took 120 years from the time it was started. And all these types of things. And of course, that got to have a lot of money. The popes fighting wars in Italy to, again, reclaim papal territory from warlords who picked off various things when the popes were away in Avignon and stuff like that. So same thing Alexander VI is doing, Julius II is doing, right? And so even though he was one of Alexander's bitterest opponents, he's doing largely the same things. So just not nepotism on the grand scale that Alexander did it, but so he needs all this money. So he commissions into making a sacrificial donation to the church to get indulgences, get your relatives out of purgatory or whatever. So people are, donating for this. And if you think of the psychology of this, you're a merchant. You got to travel. You got to get a boat. You got to do all these things. You don't necessarily have the time to do these big retreats and penances and spiritual things. Oh, but I can, give some of my money to build a hospital or something like that. Or that's where you think it's going. It's actually going to pay for the Sistine Chapel, but or something of that sort. And that'll add to the church's spiritual treasure. That'll get me out of purgatory, get grandma out of purgatory. Why don't I do it? And that's the rationale for why this gets adopted. And then once it gets adopted, it gets horribly abused. And local people do it. Like one place where it didn't get abused was Spain, because Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, who was the bishop in Toledo, ended up basically running the country after Isabella died and Ferdinand started fighting wars elsewhere.
Okay. Now that we got audio fixed again,
right?
So we're talking about Spanish.
Yeah. So start back before I quit when I went through that again. So Cardinal Jimenez gets his bull from Julius II and allowing for indulgences to be sold, and he rips it up. It's never done in Spain. So Spain doesn't have this problem. They might have other ones, but they don't have this one. So this bull gets received in Poland. They start doing it there. Leo X, Giulio de' Medici, becomes pope, and of course he says, "Well, God has given us the papacy, so let us enjoy it." And so he, feasting and partying, and he's not completely as bad as some of his predecessors, but isn't too worried about where and how he gets money. So he expands this indulgence, as far and wide as he can. So he sends a German Dominican named Tetzel into Germany to preach on indulgences. And, some of the things he says are not terribly far off from some of the things Luther was saying. And so it is a real problem. So what ends up happening is that, people are getting this notion, oh, we can just pay the church and get into heaven that way. And paying for salvation, that becomes, whether he said that explicitly or he said it in such a way where that's what people took from it. Right. That's what was happening. And on top of that, he adds insult to injury by transferring the right to commission indulgences from the Augustinians in Erfurt to the Dominican house. So that ticks off the Dominicans. So Luther's superior comes to him and says, I want you to look into this indulgence question. And the fruit of that is the 95 Theses. Now, the 95 Thesis, what is that? A lot of Protestants would be shocked if they actually went through it, because a lot of it is actually Catholic. It's not, there's a legendary thing of Luther coming in and nailing this up on the cathedral doors. Completely false. That didn't happen. If you had a time machine, you went back to 31st October, 1517. And you're waiting, and you say, all right, I want to see Reformation Day happen. And then you're sitting there outside the cathedral, people coming out of Mass. It's the eve of All Saints, All Hallows Eve, so it's a day of fast and partial abstinence. People are getting preparations for when some of the celebrations begin after First Vespers at night. Nothing's really doing. You're sitting there in Wittenberg, you're looking around, and nothing's happening. You're like, what's going on here? When's this supposed to happen? Sun's going down, about 4:45ish that time of year, I think. And you're still waiting. Nothing's happened. And now a little clerk comes down from the university and he's got a whole bunch of things rolled up in his arm. He's got a bucket of glue. Because you didn't nail things into the doors because you destroyed the doors. You pasted it up with glue or something. And it is commonly done to announce, it's a community bulletin board because that's the one place where everyone's going to be at some point during the week. So you put out announcements, you put out civil edicts will be put up there, theological disputations, which the 95 Thesis is. It's an announcement that there'll be a disputation on these 95 points, these theses. And public disputation. People would go to these and watch them, watch the funny doctors in the university and their hats come argue in Latin about things. And so the 95 Thesis then, the clerk would have glued it up there and walked away and be like, well, that's it. And you walk up and then you see, the 95 Thesis and be like, well, I can't read this. It's in Latin. And it was. And so that's it. That's Reformation Day. That's what happened. On 31st October.
Saying that he nailed it to the door, though, is much more dramatic and theatrical.
And it's something that grew. It's like so much about Luther grows in the telling, and the history grows in the telling of so many. In fact, the fact of it is, 2 weeks later, it was translated into German by some of Luther's students and circulated that way. And then it created a storm, and a sensational storm. Getting all the popular indignation now focused on the church. So, in a certain respect, the effect of that story is somewhat true, but the way in which it's told and it supposedly came about is false. But that's how it starts, and then Luther becomes kind of a celebrity, technically, which he wasn't expected to be. And so he starts, arguing with the church authorities like Albert of Brandenburg to address the situation. Albrecht of Brandenburg was not going to do that. He's one of the most corrupt prelates, and I don't know if he knew very much about theology. He certainly did about hunting and feasting and other things, and so he ignores anything from Luther, and so Luther starts now, publicizing his doctrines. And he finds a protector, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. Now, it's interesting, too, that all the early things that Luther attacks, he doesn't attack relics, not yet. Because Frederick the Wise has a chapel that is full with as many relics as he could possibly collect, find, pay for, whatever, or manufacture, who knows. And so this is like a big source of revenue in there too, as people leave alms and whatnot for the upkeep of the church and whatnot. So Luther leaves that one alone because he realizes he's getting political protection from Frederick of Saxony, which for him, this is like a political bargaining chip with the Emperor Maximilian I. So, as Maximilian I wants to centralize in his grandson, Charles, the King of Spain, when he becomes Holy Roman Emperor, and Charles V will pursue a lot of the similar policies. So that's why a lot of the German nobles will end up supporting Luther even after the Diet of Worms, as like a bargaining chip to resist the centralizing policies that Charles V wants to employ in the empire. Because each state of the Reich, it's largely autonomous, and there's only certain things the emperor can do. And in major issues, of course, he can lead the whole empire as one. But very few had done that since the Crusades, really. Maybe with the exception of like a Sigismund or someone like that. But it's it's a complicated thing trying to break down the politics of the Holy Roman Emperor. But
right.
Charles ultimately needs the support of the protesting nobles, and that's actually how the word Protestant gets born. It has nothing to do with Luther, except in pure accidents. It's actually the nobles protesting over the cause of Luther, holding their military support if the Turks should invade as kind of their thing, why Luther should be allowed to go. And that's the origin of the term Protestant. It has nothing to do, per se, with the doctrine. It has to do with the politics.
Oh, interesting.
But, it's one of those other things that are kind of lost to the historical game. And so Luther is then kind of a political prisoner, and he's writing books. So he writes, the Babylonian captivity of the church. He writes on the slave will, like his work against human free will. He writes, which is a messy book. He's all over the place, changes his mind a couple of times. And he writes a few other treatises. Eventually he'll write on the abolition of private mass, and he argues against the mass being a sacrifice. He argues... it says the devil told him to write the book, which is part of the way he would just bombastically say stupid things to be obnoxious. But, and then, as he continues and becomes a celebrity, writes against celibacy, tells the monks your vows are meaningless. And a lot of monks, they decide, we got to get out of here if they want to keep their vows and be Catholic. The ones who say, hey, this sounds like a great idea, they go out and get married. And Luther himself marries a nun, which is something that was totally unheard of. To marry someone who was a consecrated virgin. Back in those days, you didn't get let out of your vows.
Right.
Like a consecrated nun, you were considered to be consecrated to Jesus Christ. And it's like only on the gravest of reasons. And even then, you were still held to do the office.
Yeah.
And so, like, you were never held to be fully 100% absolved from those vows. And so it's a messy business all around. And then, Luther argues with people and debates different people. He sees Cardinal Cajetan, and Cajetan de Vio is the head of the Dominican order, a great theologian. And Luther even says contemporaneously, I expected to find an inquisitor, and instead I found a father. And,
wow.
and Cajetan was very nice with him, and whatever effect Cajetan had, Luther quickly abandons it and shifts it all around. So it's kind of becoming a bigger thing, and people are now revolting against church authority. Heresy is now spreading, wide under the banner of Lutheranism. Whether Luther taught it or not didn't really matter. So something needs to be done about it. So the Pope, after giving Luther time to recant, he issues the bull Exsurge Domine, which condemns, I forget precisely how many articles of Luther's teaching. So Luther's response is to burn the bull publicly, as well as the entire corpus of canon law. He burns it all away. And so from that point, I guess Lutheranism is now a thing. So Henry's watching all this stuff from Germany, sees, what's going on. And he decides that this is the way I'm going to make my mark now, because since, war was too expensive. Although he'll start engaging that later once he thinks he's got the help and the support from Charles V. So I'm going to fight with the pen. So he writes the book, The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which lays out the case against Luther's teaching, defending, the sacraments of the Church, against Luther, examining, different things, contradictions in Luther's teaching, brings forward, the testimonies of ancient fathers, which again would have been supplied to him by other theologians, but is still his writing.
Right.
And so for this, he has a wonderfully, beautifully embroidered copy prepared and sent to the Pope. And Leo X is so, excited that, because here's the crowned head of Europe, writing a book against Luther and defending the papacy. So the Pope responds, he concedes Henry a title, which was meant to be toward his person, not to be hereditary. You still see it on British coins, FD, Fide Defensor, defender of the faith,
right.
Which at that very moment he was. So Luther gets really ticked off. And Luther, he doesn't take any talk back from anybody. So, because, he's formally declared his doctrine comes from heaven. What can you possibly say against that, right? So he writes a book against Henry, mischaracterizes most of Henry's arguments, calls him a dolt, a dog, a fool, a clown.
And Luther used some pretty foul language, did he not? Extremely
foul language. All the equivalents of the F word and the S word, they're all there. So Henry puts it out there that he'd like a response, but he can't, royal protocol being what it is, he can't acknowledge the book because of all the things that are said in it. He just can't do that. So
he can't acknowledge Luther's book?
Luther, he can't acknowledge the insult, and because then he's seen to be getting into the mud.
Okay.
With this heretic writing all these things against him that are so.
That's like 16th century Facebook.
Yeah, basically, yeah. To get down to it, and so he taps More. So More does something that's interesting. It's still a bit of an embarrassment to Thomas More scholars. He writes under a pseudonym, William Roscius. And there was a William Roscius that had an Englishman who had died on pilgrimage in Rome, so people actually assumed he was the author, right? And he, I know I had another lighter, but that's all right. I'll use this one. He writes, dealing with Luther's arguments, and then calls Luther every name in the book, and with more proficient and better Latin curse words than Luther had used. And so,
who was this?
Thomas More.
Thomas More.
Thomas More, literally it says, that somebody should rip off your effing, cursed head from here and should lay an S word down your throat. It's in there, and he uses it in other places too with classical allusions. So what his intent was, and he even apologizes for it. He's not trying to use foul language for the purpose of using foul language, for the sake of it. What he's doing is trying to show that Luther is so stupid that using foul language, I can use the foul language so much more eloquently and intelligently than Luther did, and this is why he's so stupid.
I see.
That's really but Henry wasn't really satisfied with that. So Fisher is more or less tapped to write a response. And that's, of course, that was written in Latin. All this is written in Latin because it's for international audiences. English is, considered just a provincial language. Nobody learns English. You learn Latin, or you go and you speak French, and so on and so forth. So Fisher writes in Latin, the defense of the royal assertion against Luther's Babylonian captivity and his response to Henry VIII. Longer Latin title than that, and so we'll be publishing the very first English translation of that. And I'm glad to see a lot of Fisher's getting a little more attention, because I think Angelus Press just published Fisher's treatise against another Lutheran named Oecolampadius on the Eucharist. But this is the first time this treatise has ever seen the light of day.
Wow.
And again, he just shreds Luther from one end to the other, but theologically, with a keen insight, he does it. Normally he quotes Luther at length and then responds at length, like in his other books against Luther, like in the assertion of the articles and whatnot. But in this one, what he does is, cites different things from Luther to make demonstrations of how Luther did not really answer Henry, how he has contradicted himself, how he's arrogant and boastful, how he doesn't fit the characteristics that St. Paul gives in the New Testament, and against the witness of the church fathers, and so defending the sacraments of the church, so many other things that he does with great energy. And he also goes to great lengths to defend Henry, which is amusing when you consider the 12 years down the road where that's going to end,
right?
And what thanks he gets for the whole job. But it was a really well-written book. It actually appeared before another book, much longer one, which is the confutation of the reasserted articles, which he takes, where we're going to mention how Luther gets these articles condemned by Leo X, and he reasserts them all. So Fisher takes all these articles he's reasserted and refutes them at great length. This whole treatise is like 800 pages, the second one. And so he was going to publish that earlier than he did the defense of Henry, but he heard there's a possibility Luther might recant, so he decided he wanted to hold off. And so the defense of Henry got published first. Then once it was clear that Luther was not recanting, then he let full barrel with the refutation of the articles.
Wow.
And so, and he just shows himself to be a masterful theologian in all of it, and both here and in the refutation of the articles. Both of those books were cited very frequently in the theological discussions at the Council of Trent, because Luther, and on the section on justification, Fisher was actually cited more than St. Thomas.
Really?
in the theological circles and discussions, preparing the final document, because St. Thomas writes on these matters and he lays certain things out, but ultimately Fisher's dealing with the very propositions that Luther is putting out that the council means to condemn. And so Fisher was very heavily cited for this reason. And that's why Father Edmund Sertz, he wrote a book examining a lot of these things, as well as Fisher's theological writings. It's called The Works and Days of John Fisher. It's out of print. I do want to get that book back in print, but I have to deal with Harvard University Press, so who knows. Hey, Harvard, if you're listening, want to take your mind off the political controversies, you can let me republish that book. But anyway, even if I didn't make any money on it, I'd republish it just for how good it is. But Father Edmund Sertz is a Jesuit back when that was a good thing. He after examining all of Fisher's theological writings, he muses that really Fisher should be named a doctor of the church. So hopefully our efforts for kind of getting this stuff back into English will help to that. I'm not going to hold my breath.
So Fisher is not currently a doctor of the church.
No, he should be.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's how important he was, and he was considered now the greatest theologian in Europe. So what does Luther do? Completely ignores it. Luther did not ignore anybody, even other Protestants that went after them. He'd write vicious tracts against them. Fisher writes in Luther's Quiet. One, there really was no answer to it, ultimately. And two, Fisher was also known to be the holiest bishop in Christendom. He was known to fast very frequently. He was known not to have feasts. Even when he had gatherings of his friends at the Episcopal Palace, he'd retire early to go to his chapel to pray. He was known to distribute alms and to make sure his priests were well trained. He preached to the people directly on the Scripture. There was no way you could. He is the very model of a reforming bishop. He creates a seminary before it had that name, right? Before 30 years before Trent even gets going, he creates a seminary.
Right, in St. John's College.
St. John's College, Cambridge. So it, the entire university wasn't, but it had a very specific, focused training house for priests, so attached to it. And that's what he does. And so Luther, he couldn't attack Fisher's morals. He couldn't attack his conduct of life, and he would look really stupid for it. And it was probably Melanchthon or excuse me, or somebody else in Luther's circle that said, "You better just ignore it."
Yeah, because if he addressed it, then it would bring attention to it, and then he would have to try to come up with some kind of argument against it. And I'm just going to ignore it, and that way I don't have to deal with it. And of course, back at that time, you didn't have the internet and Facebook and everything where it was widely read, and so yeah.
So, or you had an equivalent in terms of the bomb that the printing press is in terms of social communications and everything. It really is.
Yeah, because that was right at the time when the printing press was coming out.
It was when it was hitting critical mass. So the printing press is in the 1450s. I might have the dates wrong on that. It's 1456 or 1476. One of those two is in my head. 1476 sounds way too late, but certainly it hadn't hit critical mass until in the 1500s, where now you have a lot of them.
That's another misconception too, that the church didn't care about people. They were trying to hide the scriptures and everything from the common man, and so people didn't know the scriptures because the church was hoarding it and hiding it and not teaching it. And it took Luther, and
it's more Lutheran propaganda from tracts he put out on the printing press. The fact is, the economy of hand copying manuscripts did not allow for it made it so there's not really a demand on literacy to such an extent where everyone should be literate. You don't need to be literate to do your job. You don't even need to be literate to be fairly successful. Now, most medievals were not illiterate in the sense that they'd see written writing. They could read in general some things. They're used to. They knew their alphabet. They knew how to translate on page, but they did not have a habit toward reading. And you see at the time, people could look at something. They could see their name. They could recognize their name. They could recognize the name of some saint. They could write and spell their names. They do so in court documents. People who are joiners and all these different trades. They did some reading. They did not do pleasure reading. They didn't have books on their shelves because you didn't have books. Because they're
so expensive and time consuming to make.
Expensive. And now you could produce other ones faster than a Bible is going to take you 20 years to produce because this is the Word of God. This is the most sacred text of texts. So it's got to be illuminated with gold. It's
and entirely handwritten out.
And you can't just. The only time you'll see a Bible that doesn't have that kind of illumination are editions basically prepared for a preacher that needs a quick, handy thing that's not so expensive and not so precious. And so, and that's going to be like one book of the Bible or something. You're not getting a whole one, which is in a codex, the word codex, a late Latin word, and which refers to, being sewn together and, covered with a board or something, as opposed to most writing, even through the Middle Ages, is on a scroll. And you open up parts of it and read it, and then you close. Open up more parts of it, and that's why it's double columned and things of this sort. That's habits that come from Roman copying of manuscripts. So that's why people can't sit down and read books because the economy of the day doesn't allow them to do that.
Right.
And not the church, not laws, not whatever. And so there's no demand for literacy. You don't need to be literate in order to, carry out your state in life. If you are embarking on something, and that's why you go to university. Now they were, were free grammar schools. Monks were teaching people literacy and writing, and that's how, even if kids failed out of the grammar school and they just didn't have it to do Latin or whatever, they could still, read sections of what they needed to read and know. And so that's the...
But John Fisher, he went to great lengths to preach directly to the people and teach them.
And the people were better learned in the scripture in those times than I would argue in any age except for perhaps the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, everyone's taught to read, everyone's reading a Bible, they're forced to memorize their Bible. Whether there's devotion there or not, everyone knows it. Even atheists know
You also have
Bible.
the advantage of the printing press.
Right. And so but they also, with that advantage, they also had to learn it and read it. Whereas today we have the advantage of the printing and digital and everything else, and nobody reads the Bible. Even Protestants don't read the Bible. Don't give me this. They read the sections they like in the Bible.
Right. How
many people are doing deep study? I've met Protestants that don't know anything about the Bible, and just as there are Catholics that don't know anything about the Bible. And so, and just in the general, but also the general culture. You look at the 19th century and say England, and atheists and agnostics, they know the Bible. They had to read it. They knew large parts of it even by heart. and they would reference it like literature, and they didn't believe in it, but they knew it. Today they don't even know it. Even scholars of PhDs, and their Latin is bad. They'll completely mistranslate something in a section from Wycliffe, and which is a well-known Bible verse, and they don't even know the original verse in English to help support their bad Latin and trying to translate it for their book. And it's like, but these people have PhDs and they're publishing books. It's like, come on, really? That's where we're at now.
Yeah.
So in Fisher's time, people, and you can see this by references to biblical stories in popular literature, in music, people, names. Old Testament as well as New Testament names that are all very popular. So in Catholic England, and so then people point, oh, they had the stained glass windows that gave them well, that's only part of the story. They had the stained glass windows and the sacred art that gave the biblical stories, and they had the preaching to open it up. Mm-hmm. And when the preaching was not well done or not frequent, then the biblical literacy would lag a bit. And so but in general, most people had a good functional understanding of the scripture. And even if they didn't have it to read in their own language, they have its content. And of course, you have Fisher translating at length from the Vulgate in his sermon to the penitential Psalms and giving what it is in English. And like you see the original copies that were printed in like the 1520s, they have, the Latin, he'll quote the Latin, and then he gives an extemporaneous translation into English for his listeners. So that John Colet, the Dean of St. Paul's, he actually published a thing on the New Testament in English that you could buy, right? There were, even Luther comes out with this propaganda point, and I think it was Zwingli who attacked him and said, nobody's going to believe this, which, of course, the benefit of time and forgetfulness people do now.
Right.
But he says, nobody's going to believe that you just discovered the Bible one day. You were a monk. You had to sing it every single day. And besides that, everyone knows there's been Bibles in German and Bibles in French and Bibles in Spanish for at least 50 to 60 years.
Yeah.
And it's like, they were there. So it's a total nonsense point. Oh, yeah, the church tried to lock up the Bible. This thing was valuable. It took 20 years to make by hand. It's illuminated with gold. You're darn right it's chained in the church, because you could make tons selling that on the black market. So, and you can't get a new one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was chained in the church. So was the Book of Hours.
Even if it wasn't filled with illuminations and everything, it would still take such a long time to hand write out the entire Bible on vellum,
right?
Animal skin, they have to take the time and effort to make all the pages out of animal skins.
How many hours it would take just to produce like a page? It's something like 100 man hours to produce one page of vellum.
Yeah.
It's crazy that amount of time. You've got to boil the hide, and then you can scrape the hair off of it, and then it's got to be treated in something acidic. So usually they use urine. In the monasteries, they'd actually use the abbot's urine, because he had the best diet, and therefore he'd have the best urine for curing the skin, right? And then they would treat it further, and then after about that much labor, you'd get
what a lovely job to have.
I know, right? Yeah.
Or even if they were making paper pages too, but even then, the process of making a paper page back then was extremely laborious and time consuming.
No, it was. Thus you have durable paper in books that survive even to today. And I've got a few from like the 1500s and the 1600s, some books like that, and the paper is incredibly durable. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. If only we use paper like that now. Even the decent cream paper that my printing company, the printing company I use, they're trying to switch me out to like Roundwood, which is like your cheaper dime novel paper, and it's like, but there's no difference in price. I'm like, you guys aren't helping me here. They automatically switched me out, and now I got complaints I don't even know. Yeah. They switched out, like, what? And I got to switch it back, and they know, don't switch these books. Please don't switch these books. But anyway.
So John Fisher went to great lengths to try to preach to the people, not on himself directly, but then also went to great lengths to try to train priests to educate them so that they could go preaching.
He ordained almost all the priests that were destined for his diocese directly. He examined them previously. Any priest that was doing something bad, it was said that the early biographer says they would tremble at the sound of a horse coming, because they could be the gaunt figure of the bishop coming to read them the riot act. Any priest that was in trouble or needed help or didn't have sufficient funds, Fisher would be found to be a father and to help them out. And that's actually one of the greatest crises of our time. among the many crises, that the one really great one is that priests don't consider their bishops to be a father, by and large. There's those exceptions that prove the rule. Most of them kind of consider them as like the HR tyrant, ready to destroy them if they get slightly out of line.
Right.
And so but their
or at least an
father.
administrator.
Yeah, just an administrator, not a father that's
Right.
there to provide for them in the work of the gospel. And that's one of the things that Fisher was exactly the opposite in so many ways.
So, how then do we get to the point where Fisher is being attacked and martyred?
So this is...
when did he become a bishop, and then when did he become a cardinal?
Well, the cardinal was at the end. He never actually formally wore cardinal's robes, or that was an intervention by Pope Paul III to try and prevent Henry from executing him, as he figured, Henry wouldn't kill the cardinal. And that didn't
Little
work.
did he know.
Little did he know. Henry is supposed to have said, "Let the Pope send his hat when he will, but he'll have to wear it on his shoulders." So, but ultimately, I would say it's about 1526 when that fate is sealed, and that's when Anne Boleyn finally gives in to Henry, but with the proviso that he has to marry her, make her queen. So why does the Reformation happen in England? It's entirely an accident. As was it Belloc who said it, or Robert Hugh Benson? I forget, but that's entirely true. So we've seen that Henry was a crusader for the Pope, and in his book he defends papal supremacy. But we got to get into Henry's character a little bit. Henry is the type of guy, I scratched your back, you have to scratch mine. So during the wars with France in the 1511 through 1514 or so, and he's winning these tremendous victories against the French in northern France. Takes Terouanne and Tournai, and humiliates the French army before Terouanne. Then, Ferdinand, who was the other partner in that alliance, he's supposed to go in and fight the French on the other side. And really, he just kind of dithers around. He takes Navarre, puts that into his possession, French Navarre, and then the better part of it. And then, fights a few rearguard actions against the French in a few places. And that's it. Doesn't really do anything to support Henry. Doesn't pay him any of the money he promised. So that ticks off Henry. He decides, you know what, that's it. So at the conclusion, he makes peace with Louis the XII. And he marries his sister. I always get which one wrong. I believe it was Margaret Tudor. Or was it the elder Mary Tudor? Henry's sister. I think it was Henry's sister Mary. But now I'm drawing a blank, unfortunately. I should know this, but I haven't thought about this in a while, so I got the names mixed up. I'm going to go with Mary Tudor. Elder Mary Tudor, not his daughter Mary. She was married to Louis XII, and to the horror of Catherine of Aragon, that Henry's making peace with her nation's enemy. But her father ticked him off, so he didn't get his back scratched, so he's going to look elsewhere for that now. That breaks apart, and he's back at war with France later when Louis XII dies. And then you have 1511. He is going to Our Lady of Walsingham to give thanks for the birth of his son, also named Henry. And on his way back from having given thanks to the Virgin for the birth of his son, he gets his couriers meet him to let him know his son is dead, died two weeks after birth. So after that, that's it. The Virgin is right out of Henry's devotion, and now he's going to find another saint to be his patron saint, because she didn't. That's how everything is for him. And so, he scratched the Ferdinand's back, and he should have gotten scratched back. No, so he pisses off the Spanish alliance. Let's go to the French. Again, similar thing with Charles V. Charles V comes to England. He's got a revolt in Spain, the Commonwealth revolt against his authority. And he needs to get back to Spain. He needs Henry's ships to get him to Spain. And he promises Henry the Moon he's going to help get Wolsey elected pope. He's going to, they'll fight a crusade and crush the French, and he'll get all kinds of lands in France. He'll be, every bit the king that Henry V would have been if he lived. He'll get all these things and all this money. Charles promises the moon, but he doesn't deliver. Henry sends troops in under the Duke of Surrey in 1523. Charles V never materializes. He sends troops in striking distance in Paris in 1524. Charles V doesn't materialize. When does this alliance happen? He hasn't paid any money yet. Henry's broke. 1525 comes around. Henry's like, we're going to sit this one out. Bad time to do it, because then the Battle of Pavia takes place, and Charles V defeats the French, captures Francois I, and Henry did not have an army in the field. And so he, writes to Charles, giving thanks for this great victory, and declares, let's now destroy this Valois dynasty as the just punishment they deserve from God, and partition France. And Charles is like, I just got rid of a powerful rival. I'm not going to create another one.
Yeah.
And so he tells Henry, well, if you want your part of France, you got to conquer it yourself. So Henry scrambles to get the money and to get all of that together. And Parliament won't give him money. So Wolsey comes up with this idea of a forced loan. But being the spin doctor in chief, he calls it the amicable grant. It wasn't very amicable. And not only were the nobles quaffing at it, but even the average people
maybe that could be your
revolting.
nickname, the amicable
Yeah,
grant.
there we go. But they're not very amicable unless I've had enough tobacco and alcohol. I keep it that way, but no, that's not true. But sounds good though. But anyway, it's so the people are revolting because they know that they're going to get taxed more heavily to pay for this money, so Henry can go fight a war in France. Ultimately, it's going to end up the same as the other ones. So Henry has to give up and just accept he's not going to be a new Henry V. He's not going to make his mark on the European stage. And, and if he had died right then, he would have been like another English monarch, going back from the 100 Years' War, trying to make England great in the continent and not succeeding. But he doesn't. And so something else happened. So now the Spanish, again, had not scratched his back. Charles V had not only refused to pay, but he was temporarily betrothed to Henry's daughter, Mary. And he breaks that betrothal. I mean, she was very young, and marries someone else. And so Henry feels the sting of that too, and Catherine specifically, because then Henry and Catherine, she was older than Henry when they got married. Now she's a frumpy 40, clearly not going to have any more kids. Henry is still young and handsome and in his prime, and has already had a couple of mistresses. And so he, the whole dynastic reasoning for the marriage has failed. The natural end of marriage, to have a son to keep his reign going, has failed. And so, again, in this way, his back, again, has not been scratched, really. And it fits with his psychology and how he treats things and how he treats people. So he decides, now Henry will be perfectly wonderful to his wife so long as you're married to him. Once you're not, that's when, and that's why, once it's not working, he's trying to get out of that and find someone who will work for him. So Anne Boleyn catches his eye. Now, Anne Boleyn, she is the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, who was really impressed by Margaret of Ghent's kind of finishing school for girls in the Netherlands, in Brussels. And so, he sends Anne and there to kind of get trained up. She becomes incredibly well educated in French, and to the point where, as an English woman, speaks French so much so that you would never know she was English, which is high praise from the French. They don't give that praise, especially to the English. And so then she's trained in like statecraft, diplomacy, all the things that happen at court, and how to be, a royal lady at court. And so she's very popular in the French court. She really becomes a coquette. She's described as sexy rather than beautiful. She could, make her eyes just, steal your soul with her eyes. This is how she's described. Anne Boleyn. So she's very much liked to the French court, and she also takes note of the fact that when French ladies give in and become mistresses, they become discarded with children and no support, or married off somewhere and now no longer important. So she decides she's not going that way. She's recalled to England by Wolsey about 1524, if I'm not mistaken. Part of Wolsey's idea that we'll marry her off to some noble to settle some dynastic squabbles, that falls through. And so she's at court now, and she's a real dynamo. But Henry hasn't really noticed, because Henry's dealing with the war in France and so many things. Then, has a secret betrothal to one Thomas Percy, who's sort of like a political prisoner for his dad, who's not on good terms with Henry. And so it's a sign of good conduct. Your son's living in Wolsey's household. So he and Anne become very close. They fall in love, very much so. And they have a secret betrothal. Now, Anne also has a ton of simps in her train, including one Thomas Wyatt, a poet, and he writes about it. And he's a complicated marital situation, and so he and his wife are separated. They haven't gone through any procedure to get annulled or whatever. They're not in any way civilly divorced. So he's just kind of doing whatever. And he sees Anne, but she's never going to yield to him. So he's always chasing her, complete simp, as it were, to employ the modern terminology for that. So then Henry notices her. And we don't know precisely when Henry notices her, but we know when the dates of the ensuing things take place. Henry wants her to be his mistress. And so he makes Wolsey his wingman. Wolsey's got to get rid of the Thomas Percy. And so he does everything possible. And Percy, even though he's a bit of a dilettante himself, he does show great resolve in wanting to marry Anne. And then so Wolsey brings down his father, and they upbraid him so much that finally he agrees to call off the betrothal. So then, which hurt Anne very bitterly. And so according to George Cavendish, who was Wolsey's servant, later writes the biography of Wolsey, is that at that moment, Anne decided to do my master, that is Wolsey, as much injury as he had done her. And so she devotes herself somehow going to, bring about his downfall. So she hates Cardinal Wolsey. Not realizing, of course, that Henry is the one who asked him to do it. So Wolsey gets Percy out of the way, and now Henry's free to move. And so he sends in asking for, her to become his mistress. And she says no. And it's really complicated. It's the only way in which you could tell the king no. And Henry is just, beside himself with this. It sparks a bit of romance. This is like out of Tales of Courtly Love. He hasn't felt this way in years. He feels renewed. He's even more obsessed with her. So we have Henry's side of this correspondence that ensues over 1535. 1525. Excuse me. We do not have Anne's side of it. Because Henry would have had it, and Henry probably would have destroyed it later after Anne didn't work out, and he had ever beheaded and all this stuff. So, but Anne survives.
Now her beheading, that was just a way of getting her out of the way so that he could legitimately marry
Jane. So yeah, an annulment was out of the question, and it's that was the only way. So it was a trumped up charges of incest and treason and all these things. And that because we won't touch more upon her, so I'll just mention, for a queen to have an extramarital affair is treasonous. Kings, well, they can do whatever.
Yeah.
But because a queen is through whom the true issue is supposed to come. If a queen were to bear somebody else's child,
sure, yeah.
Now it becomes treasonous. You can upset the entire succession. You can't have that. So thus, the king can do whatever he wants, apparently, and that's kind of accepted. You even have like a formal position for it in the French court, a formal, royal mistress, right? Which is what,
really?
Oh yeah. Which is what Henry seems to want to install Anne as in the beginning. And then instead, that's not what ends up happening. But so in the end, once it's not working out, Anne did not make the transition from royal mistress to being queen, which has a very accepted state of behavior and things, and she would give Henry, a piece of her mind in public. And that it was one thing, before, but now that you're a queen, you have to be a queen, and she never made that transition. And so on top of that, they went to blows. She was pregnant with twins, and then Henry had a jousting accident, and the horse landed on top of him. He blacked out for 6 hours. This is about 1535, I believe. Or 6? No, 5.
Wow.
And later, 1535. So Anne panicked, and she had a miscarriage. And she miscarried 2 twin boys. So now Henry sours on her. Again, back hasn't been scratched. I do this, but you didn't provide this. You didn't succeed as a royal baby maker, just like Catherine didn't. And so she does produce Anne, a girl, so Henry's disappointed. Or not Anne, sorry, Elizabeth, excuse me. And then on top of that, Anne is arguing with him, and the magic is gone. And that's why he goes looking for a mistress in Jane Seymour. And then people around Henry marry Princess Mary's supporters like Nicholas Carew, several other people. Nicholas Carew is the groom of the stool. There's other people close to Henry that don't like how Princess Mary's been treated, and so they're trying to support her in the whole business. So they couch Jane Seymour had to follow the same route that Anne did. And that gets Henry inflamed with passion. So, and they start working the propaganda machine, and they think they're using Cromwell. Cromwell's actually using them. And he'll break all of Mary's supporters and break Mary, too, to make her swear the Act of Supremacy through all this. But in the meantime, they think they're using Cromwell, because Cromwell's a far more intelligent actor. through the whole thing. And so he causes it that, to bring about Anne's destruction and lead Anne into arguing with Henry more. And at one point, Anne tells Henry he's no good in bed in public. Henry decides he's not going to take that lying down. And next thing you know,
he's not going to take that lying down.
Various people are now arrested and accused of having adultery with the queen. She's accused of incest with her own brother and George and others. And so they're all put to death for treason, and Anne is beheaded. So the next day he marries Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour is always the good wife. Even when later on in Henry's reign, when he's married to Catherine Parr, he has a portrait done where his father and his mother, Elizabeth of York, are on the top of it. And at the bottom, Henry, and on the other side is Jane Seymour, even though he's married to Catherine Parr. Because she was the good wife. She gave him his son. And she died before she could be a problem and get beheaded. Although I think she would have been secure because she gave him the son. Right. So, and her demeanor and manner, she wouldn't have been a problem for him. But nevertheless, there's no chance for that to be a problem because she died. And because she dies after giving him the son, she's always the good wife. And so that is the reality of that's the later history anyway. So back to Fisher. So in the course of these love letters, which are in the Vatican, because somebody had snatched up these letters from Anne and carried them away to the Vatican. So the Pope's saying, your conscience, eh? I'm seeing a different conscience over here. He, obviously is pressing Anne, and it was a problem for Anne. And eventually she yields. She gives him a New Year's present in 1526. And at this point, it's on. And so later that year, Henry has a private meeting where it's all a prearranged show trial, where one of his nobles accuses him of having lived adulterously with his brother's widow because his marriage wasn't really valid because of a section of Leviticus. And they'd already been working the arguments in favor of the divorce now. When we call it the divorce colloquially. That's the term even they used then, but what they meant by that is what we call an annulment.
And that's the argument that comes up in the play and film of Man for All Seasons.
So that was the principal argument So Henry's doing all this. Wolsey Now Wolsey is the guy. He's the son of an Ipswich innkeeper that's always on the wrong side of the law for keeping unclean house, i.e. running a brothel on the side of his innkeeping duties. And so Wolsey escapes all this by going to the grammar schools. He's very brilliant. He learns Latin very well. Goes to university, opts for a career in the church as opposed to law, and he's very brilliant, and he ends up rising to the point where he gets Henry what he wants. So Henry makes him his Lord High Chancellor, and then later Cardinal, the Pope's own representative, Cardinal Latinist, which is the Pope's side, right? And so he's the Pope's official representative in England. And Wolsey runs everything. Wolsey manages to keep the control of statecraft by banishing faction at court. And so he's, all of Henry's favorites. He manages to find something for them to do. So there's nobody around, really, except a few nobles. And Wolsey can manage them. And he controls all the access to Henry. And so even when Thomas More comes in and becomes Henry's good friend, More works with Wolsey because he realizes that's how he has to do to fall in line. And he does. And he does pretty spectacularly well once he's come into court and shows his trust and everything. So there's this tradition of More and Wolsey not getting along. They actually do work together very much, and some of the traditions are based on like the good cop bad cop that More and Wolsey would play to get money out of the 1523 Parliament, for example, and things like that. So that's how Wolsey has stayed in power so long, and he always gets Henry what he wants. Now he's put to it, and now this is his position in the church, his conscience. It really is a hard matter, and his conscience is starting to wear on him, probably for the first time in his life. And so he goes and he consults John Fisher. And
Wolsey consults Fisher.
Consults Fisher. Goes to Rochester, meets with Fisher, and he doesn't tell him who, although Fisher knows precisely who and what and why. And lays out the case that's being made in this secret trial, which Catherine is able to find out about because she has very good intelligence sources. And Catherine will end up winning every single round of the fight up through the Legatine court, right? So Wolsey, consults Fisher, and Fisher says, well, the problem with that argument is that you also have one in Deuteronomy, which says to marry your brother's widow in order to raise children for her name. And so the fathers read this in union with the two. And so Henry sees that, and he's really taken aback because the greatest theologian in all Europe doesn't have his back. And so that ticks him off. So Wolsey's thinking about this more, and Wolsey finally decides it's such a hard case. He could have, now he has the power to have pronounced in favor for the annulment right there in England, and that would have been it. He could have done it. And Catherine could have appealed it, but the Pope was very unlikely to appeal what Wolsey had already done. And Wolsey knew this. So there has to be some other reason. The only real explanation is that for the first time in his life, Wolsey's conscience really gets to him. Little Jiminy Cricket saying, you can't do this, right? So he refers the case to Rome in 1527, actually, yeah, it's when it goes on, not 1526, 1527. He refers the case to Rome, and he decides he'll work his contacts. Once the Pope does it, then it's clear, and I don't have to worry about it. It's off of my shoulders now. So he revokes the case to Rome, and then the summer of that year, you have the Sacco di Roma, the sack of Rome, where Charles V's mutinous soldiery, largely made up of Lutheran Landsknechts. Landsknechts were a mercenary troop. I could probably go in hours on the military functioning of the Landsknechts. I'm not going to do that. But they were private military corps with their own rules and their own statutes and things. Some of them were Lutheran, some of them were Catholic. And they were hired originally they were supposed to be a private army for the emperor. Now they're largely mercenaries that are hired out, fighting with pike and shot on the Swiss model, but more efficiently. And so their payment went into arrears. So Charles had ordered them within striking distance of Rome to tell Pope Clement VII that you'd done bad in allying yourself with the French in this new phase of the Italian wars, and you should have stayed allied with me after all I've done for the church. So I'm just sending my army around just to let you know I'm still here, and this is a bad idea. And this is the League of Chambord that the Pope had fashioned with the French and the Genoese and others against the empire. So the troops mutiny, and the commanders end up leaving the camp, and except for one or two of them, and they end up marching on Rome, inflamed with kind of Luther's rhetoric about Rome being the whore of Babylon and everything. And they take the city, which was not prepared for an attack because they really didn't expect anything like this to happen. And they didn't expect that. Rome's defenses weren't that formidable, but they were enough. But they just didn't have the support necessary. So the Landsknechts take the city and just run riot. They did things that would have made the Nazis and the Soviets blush, honestly. And just an absolute destruction of the city. And the Pope barely escapes to the fortified citadel of Castel Sant'Angelo, which if you've been to Rome, you've been to Rome. And if your audience has been to Rome, they see it across the bridge there, the big castle with the angel on top, which is originally the mausoleum of Hadrian, kind of repurposed into a fortified palace for the Pope. So he hides out in there while the city is just being raped and pillaged and destroyed to a horrible degree. And eventually they don't leave until plague sets in.
Sorry, and whose army is this?
This is Charles V's army. These are largely German Lutheran Landsknechts. They break into the papal apartments and under Raphael's School of Athens. On the facing side is the Disputation of the Eucharist, and underneath that, somebody took his sword and wrote Luther's name into the stone underneath it. So that's. But they did so many horrible things. That German, the word German, tedesco, was a very bad word in Rome for a long time. So Germans were not terribly well looked upon for a very long time after that. But it was absolutely devastating to the city. And so on top of that, Charles, even though he condemned it, he wasn't going to let a crisis go to waste. So he made sure to take possession of, basically the Pope at that point, because he's his prisoner. So Wolsey's, revocation case gets to Rome about this time. And the Pope's like, I don't have time for this. So now he's in a real bind. He's revoked the case to Rome. He can't bring it back to England. And the Pope eventually manages to get free and get ambassadors. But now is the problem. Charles has made his point. And it's his aunt that he is now going to humiliate. And, of course, Charles has never given one whit about Catherine. But now that his whole family's honor is on the line, now he does. And Catherine's writing to him, to anyone else who will listen. She's got very good intelligence about everything that's going on. So everything devolves. And eventually I could go in the fineries of it. It'll take many hours to go through all the fineries of what ends up going on. But essentially what happens is Henry's, pleading with the Pope, gets the creation of a legatine court, and he sends Cardinal Campeggio, who is northern Italian. When his wife died, he entered the priesthood. He's a wily lawyer. He's kind of like your closer in any deal. And even though he was a priest, he was he wasn't so much in for like corruption and enriching himself per se, but he was very politically minded and savvy and not so much spiritually minded. And so Campeggio is sent to England, and so he and Wolsey kind of run this legatine court, which Catherine's protesting, and Catherine's getting intelligence on the whole game, everything that's going on. She produces a second brief, which was given by Julius II to Isabella, which undoes the entire case that that Henry's lawyers are making out. So they have to start afresh, which angers Henry to no end. Catherine plays to the crowd. She's very popular and is hated and cursed as a witch, right? And so Henry's not liking the situation, and he's very non-confrontational. He doesn't like direct confrontation. He likes to threaten you with other people behind the scenes. So Catherine takes the initiative of the legatine court, comes across, and the Cavendish gives the description of her speech. Shakespeare embodies it in his play Henry VIII. You can read it there. But where she lays this out, and puts Henry to it. You say you want to find out if it's valid. Haven't I been your wife for so many years? And haven't we, done this? What possible barrier is there if you want the marriage to prove valid? Let it be proved valid. And Henry's put to the spot, and he completely loses everything. And so then the legatine trial goes on, and Henry's trying to manufacture behind the scenes. Campeggio is beside himself because the Pope's given him a secret brief. You can withdraw the case, but he's afraid of the consequences. Namely, Wolsey has told him flat out, Henry may very well leave the church if he doesn't get his mind, because once he's set his mind to something, he means to get it. And Thomas More called this, at least Roper in his account gives this, that Thomas More says to him, after he and Henry comes to Chelsea. So Wolsey tells Campeggio flat out, Henry may leave the church. And, you see this where, Wolsey says, he would rather suffer the loss of half his kingdom than lose any part of his appetite. More says, after Roper, and this is what Roper gives in his account of More, that after Henry visited Chelsea and they seem to be getting along like great friends, Roper adds that More told him, Yea, son Roper, I tell you, that if my head would win a Himmet Castle in France, it would not fail to fall. And so whether or not that's true or that's something Roper adds, posthumously, doesn't really matter. It's true, the fact. it is the case. So, during the inquest, though, Henry tries to strong-arm all the bishops into supporting his case. And so Fisher just doesn't say anything. He's supposed to be one of Queen Catherine's lawyers, and they've got a seal begging the Pope, so they've appropriated his seal and forged his signature to a document asking the Pope to annul this marriage. And so Fisher gets up and says, it's not my seal. And everyone's kind of taken aback. Well, really? Wow. It's... And like the French ambassador, the Spanish ambassador, the president, they know everyone's in shock by what Fisher's done. And then he gets up and then he gives a long, lengthy treatise summarizing the points in a little book he's written in defense of the validity of the marriage. And he'd been thinking of this for a long time, and he was waiting until this moment. And then as he's going through it, he declares he is ready, like a new John the Baptist, to lay down his life for the validity of this marriage.
Wow.
And so, but he knew where we were going. Before the legatine inquest, the early biographer records a story where Henry asked John Fisher to come meet him in Greenwich at his palace there. And while Henry is laying out the case, Fisher says, well, my lord, I can set your conscience at ease. And he starts laying out all the reasons why the marriage to Catherine is valid. And then, and so Henry, listens and thanks him and bids him adieu. And then the early biographer adds, and he never looked upon Fisher with favor again. Which, it's a later account, but it's still
fits. Fisher, I wasn't looking for confirmation. I was looking for an excuse.
Pretty much. And so that's how it goes down. And so Fisher makes himself enemy number one by making this intervention. And so Henry, after the legatine inquest fails, Campeggio recalls the case. It never meets again, whereas Henry was really expecting it would be a verdict in his favor. It didn't happen. And so now he's got to go back. He decides to change his general. And so Wolsey is out. Henry strips Wolsey of the chancellorship. He's getting ready to give him a trial. Because
Wolsey didn't get him what he wanted.
Did not get him what he wanted. So Anne is now running things. Anne is the new general. And that's why it actually runs more efficiently. And so next they decide they have to get rid of Fisher by hook or by crook, or in this case by cook, because they actually try to poison Fisher. Now, more than likely, there was Anne Boleyn and her family's initiative to poison Fisher because Henry had a fear of poisoning, and he would have considered it beneath him to poison someone, even a rival that he wanted gone. And so and Fisher was fasting that day, and so he didn't eat. And so some servants got sick, one died, and so they prosecuted the cook who wouldn't diplomatically meant to be quiet. Was told, we'll give you a quick beheading instead of hanging, drawing, and quartering you for this. And
oh, gee, that's great comfort.
Yeah, I know. It's like, well, at least to be quick. Hopefully, if the axeman is, some of those get pretty nasty if the axeman is not sure with the axe. And but anyway, so that doesn't work. The early biographer records that Fisher was in a study, which was attached to Cambridge. A cannon went off, although more likely it was an arquebus. Rifle, and that shattered the windows inside the room. And of course the Boleyns had a residence within firing distance nearby, and so that Fisher decided to retire back to the residence and not hang out too long here. So so now things move apace, and because Anne is now running things, her family chaplain now comes to advise Henry. Her family chaplain was an otherwise obscure and unimpressive Cambridge don named Thomas Cranmer. And so Cranmer goes to Henry. You're doing this all wrong. You're trying to get the Pope to and all this, but let's look at the Scripture. I see bishops in Scripture, and I see kings in Scripture. I don't see popes. Do you see popes? I don't see any popes in Scripture. And Henry's like, yeah. And so now what was he declared he would never do back in 1523, now in the late 1520s, he decides, yes, this is where we're going. And so he sets all the machinery so Thomas More as Lord High Chancellor is actually meant to be in the new path he's going in. So now instead of a clergyman who it has been as the Lord High Chancellor for a very long time, he gets More. Now More is eminently qualified. He's one of the best lawyers in the kingdom. And and Henry tries to get More to his side.
Before, without getting real in depth, just to really brief cursory thing, what exactly is the Chancellor, the Lord High Chancellor?
So the Lord High Chancellor is, in a certain sense, like if you could roll in the Attorney General, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, all into one. And that would be the Lord High Chancellor. Okay. Just to make a banal but necessary kind of comparison to at least the way English law used to work before Tony Blair reforms. But don't get me started on Tony Blair. Nothing good to say. So someone will be there, but he converted Catholic. Yeah, he still sucks. Yeah. I'm sorry. But so you have this situation. More is now the Lord High Chancellor, and Henry tries to get More to his side. And so More, says he's not convinced, but he promises Henry that in his office as Lord High Chancellor, he won't do anything against Henry's case, which worked for a while. But once it got to a certain point, by 1532, he told Henry, "I can't do it anymore. Got to resign," because he could see where it was going. So the Commons now, with another guy who survived Henry's fall, I've already mentioned him several times, Thomas Cromwell. He survives Wolsey's fall. Sorry, I said Henry's a minute ago. I meant Wolsey. Survives Wolsey's fall and now makes himself useful to Henry as a secretary. And so he starts kind of getting things done for Henry. He gets the position exactly because Wolsey had it. He is not the Lord High Chancellor the way Wolsey was. He never will be. Once More resigns the chancellorship, Thomas Audley, who's not a terribly bright guy, but he knows to always do what Henry wants, and so that guarantees his position. He's one of the few that survives the length of Henry's reign. But Cromwell is a really brilliant political operator behind the scenes. And so he starts managing, the elections of members to the Parliament. So More actually inaugurates a Parliament that is called the Reformation Parliament in 1529, because it will inaugurate all the laws that eventually lead you to the Reformation. With Wolsey out of the way, Wolsey dies before Henry can have a treason trial just from the strain of everything. So allegedly saying, according to his biographer, Cavendish, if only I'd served my God the way I'd served my king.
Right.
And so now the church feels free again outside of Wolsey's influence. So Archbishop Warham, who's still the Archbishop of Canterbury, quite aged now, he'd been there ever since Henry VII, now begins to take up powers as the head of the English, the provincial head of the English church, as the highest metropolitan there. And as the convocation is going, Henry's ministers come in and tell all the clergy, you are guilty of praemunere. Now, praemunire is an obscure law which had been brought to light by another case I won't mention now, as it would take too much time. But basically, this is inaugurated by Edward I, or if you're familiar with Braveheart, which I hope you're not, because it's a terrible movie and historically inaccurate to such great lengths that I can't even watch it.
No.
Edward the Longshanks, although I do like Patrick Magoo, but Edward the Longshanks was 7 foot tall. That's why he has that name. Yeah. And he was a bully. And so he saw Philip the Fair was taxing the churches to fight wars in Gascony against him. And he said, well, I'm going to tax the church then. And then Pope Boniface VIII said, no, you can't tax the church. And Edward I said, watch me. And he did. So Boniface put England under interdict. And Edward basically said, well, that's nice. And he went to the priest. Well, the Pope is all the way out there. And I'm over here. Are you going to say Mass? Oh, yes, Your Highness. So the interdict was utterly ignored. And some priests tried to appeal to Rome over this. And so the Edward had a law initiated, praemunire, which meant which forbade appeals across the sea to Rome. And so, or accepting the temporal law of the Pope in England. And it was like one of those that just sat in the statute books, kind of forgotten once that crisis was over, and you get to Edward II, nobody's thinking about that anymore, it's all forgotten about. A more recent case drew that back to light, so now Henry's making full use of it. And he tells the clergy they're all guilty by accepting Wolsey as a cardinal over the church and accepting the Pope's authority. Never mind the fact what would happen to them, what Henry would have done to them had they not accepted Wolsey's.
Right.
Henry's technically guilty of it too, but now everyone they're scared because Henry was moving very determinedly in an anti-clerical direction, and most of the bishops had gotten their positions because they owed Henry something, and they all freaked out. If they all resisted him, this might have gone very differently. But the only voice speaking in resistance was Fisher.
He was the only
one
bishop.
that said, under no circumstances do we give him the title of head of the church and pay him a fine for something that doesn't even apply. We can't.
The only bishop in all of England.
Only bishop, and but everyone's wanted to cave. And Warham was the one who's the Archbishop of Canterbury should have been leading the charge. And it's interesting where you see Thomas of Becket, right, who's leading the charge of civil encroachment on the church. And then when you get to his successor in Warham is silent. Warham's got nothing to say. It's Fisher now who's speaking like a Becket, but he's not in authority. It's Warham, and Warham does nothing. So finally Fisher suggests a compromise, that perhaps we add a rejoinder, praeter legem Christi permittat, so far as the law of Christ allows. And that, sits, everyone agrees to that, so they pay the fine, and they admit head of the Church of England so far as the law of Christ allows. And at first Henry's mad, but then he says, well, all right, we'll take this for now. And then and eventually that gets dropped a bit later. But now the Commons moves in anti-clerical direction, forbidding the right of convocation to make laws to the church, forbidding the Anates tax to be paid to the Pope. Fisher gets up and warns about these things, and at first he's heated, but then Henry has him attained over some nonsense that involves like a nun who's a seer. And this is when Cromwell's men go raiding the chancery, finding all his stuff, finding that he lives like a beggar in his own palace, and for the sake of Christ's poor. And so he is let go after that. But it's meant to silence Fisher when Parliament is coming around. And so More resigns, and then Cromwell and Henry, they put all their machinations to the fore. Warham consecrated a bishop, so Henry suggested that he violated praemunire there too, which is a big stretch of the statute. Warham responds, this is the very thing which Thomas of Canterbury, it's Thomas of Becket, died for. And now all of a sudden he's got a little bit of fight in him, but it's too late. He dies a month later. And so Henry uses...
Of natural causes?
Yeah, of natural. He was old enough. It's likely enough. I wouldn't rule it out, but more than likely natural causes. And then I don't know any historian that suggests other. He was very old. Mm-hmm. So, and the strain of that all of a sudden, seeing where things were going, I'm sure broke him. Then the next thing that happens is temporarily there's been a kind of a positive relations with Henry and the papacy. So he takes advantage of this Indian summer of good relations to have Cranmer appointed as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. And which happens, and then Cranmer gets to work, and then it's only, it's not much long after that Anne must have at some point surrendered to Henry because they had a shotgun marriage because they needed to make this work to legitimize everything. So they formed the...
Shotgun marriage or blunderbuss marriage?
Yeah, at that time. So Cranmer The Simpsons satirizes this perfectly. The Simpsons actually did a little historical thing with Henry VIII, where they have Reverend Lovejoy being Cranmer, and he says, "By the authority invested in me by you, I hereby declare." That's basically what happens. He declares the marriage between Henry and Catherine to have been invalid always, and this marriage will now be valid. The marriage happens, and boom. And so they have a coronation. More decides to skip out on the coronation when he's invited. And he tells Meg, his daughter Margaret, "Mark my words, Meg, this will soon be confirmed with oaths," which is exactly what happens later that year. The Act of Succession comes down. Now, Fisher was the principal target of the Act of Succession. He had been writing a number of books and tracts against the marriage, but once it happens, he stops because he realizes it's futile, and he doesn't want to absolutely rush to martyrdom, even though he knows that's where it's going at this point. And so so he stops and just continues his life as a bishop, and then the Act of Succession comes in. So the Act of Succession forces those subjects to swear that the succession, that is the issue of Henry and Anne, will be the proper succession of the kingdom. And Fisher and More both were required. Now, More was trotted out there to swear this, and he's the only layman amongst all these clergymen. And that's because he snubbed the coronation, and Boleyn did not like that at all. So now Fisher and More both were willing to swear to the act itself because, hey, King and Parliament can decide who's going to succeed the king. That makes sense. But then there was a preamble. You also had to swear. It didn't give a form to say it, but you had to swear that the marriage between Henry and Anne was valid, and the marriage between Henry and Catherine was invalid. Right. And they wouldn't do this. So off to the Tower they go. And for about a year and some months of grueling interrogation, back and forth, being allowed
Fisher and
More both. More was treated better than Fisher. Fisher was not allowed any books. He had to beg for the various medicines he used, because now he's in his 80s, right? And he had to beg for the various medicines he used to keep himself going, or he's in his 70s, I'm sorry. Very old, and ill health, frail. And More, on the other hand, is allowed his books. Eventually his daughter gets in to see him, because she goes to Cromwell, Margaret, and she's... and I actually, if we were doing anything on Thomas More, I'd talk all about Margaret's education. She was a really amazing woman. But she swears the Act of Supremacy with the rejoinders, so far as the law of Christ allows. So which is her conscience for not swearing this thing, but at the same time for trying to gain access. So Cromwell ignores the little proviso and just says, oh, good, I can use her to break More. And so she's in, and she's a huge support to More. She really, helps him in so many different ways to prepare the way for his martyrdom and whatnot. Fisher, on the other hand, he has his brother comes to see him, one of his younger brothers, or his half-brother, and then, to bring him what little food he can get and medicine and things like that. So it's during this time that you have a new pope, Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III was a Cardinal Farnese, and he was present during the Sacco di Roma. He saw these horrors that were committed, and and he had been kind of a dilettante at one part of his life, and he'd been a lay cardinal, was unfaithful to the state that because it still required you to be celibate. Mm-hmm. So Farnese, he had illegitimate children and whatnot, got serious about the church and reform, was hoping to get elected earlier, but then it was actually another Medici Pope, Clement VII, that gets elected. And so he had to kind of bide his time. And then once he became Pope, he decides in this grand reforming program. He's still had the nepotism in. Of course, he's still looking to aggrandize his biological children.
Paul III.
But he's still looking at, so his first mission is to get good cardinals in place in the church. And so people like Cafara, who'll be the future Paul IV, actually won't... He'll be problematic when he's Pope to a certain extent. But anyways, fiery reforming cardinal, a big part of the Theatine movement. You get a whole number of other people that have been working very heavily for reform of the church. And one of the top people he wanted was John Fisher. And then he gets acquainted with the actual situation with Fisher. And so he decides he needs to move ahead and make him a cardinal right away. Because he figures, if he's a cardinal, Henry won't kill him. And his ambassadors work this out with the French king. And Francois I tells him, I don't think that's going to work. Once Henry said his mind,
he'd already done it with Wolsey.
Yeah, and so well, he didn't kill Wolsey, but I mean, he stripped him. He was going to have a treason trial for him, but anyway, Paul III wouldn't have known anything about that. Instead, Francois I's ambassador says, well, sometimes he treats me like a friend, sometimes he treats me like a servant. His mood is unpredictable. I don't think this is going to be a very successful thing. And so he, so the Pope makes him a cardinal, which leads to a new, fresh round of interrogations. You must have been, in communication with Rome somehow, because any communication like that, they could convict him of treason. There was one communication that Fisher had made prior to being imprisoned in the Tower, where if they knew about it, they could have killed him. And that was when Fisher saw the direction that everything is going. For the sake of the church herself, he asked Charles V to intervene militarily in England and remove Henry.
Wow.
And that was only because he saw that the ecclesiastical society is higher than the civil society. And as a result, as much as he loved his own country, and the thought of it must have been horrendous to him as he wrote it. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see the original parchment, to see the actual lines on it, writing such a dread thing.
Yeah.
But that's why it was so. He never would have said that unless he thought this is the absolute thing. Because what is England without the Catholic faith?
Yeah.
And so and he wrote that through the imperial ambassador Chapuis, who was in England, very, very intelligent figure. Chapuis is a good source for a lot of information, and he started gathering a lot of information for Charles V. He was the imperial ambassador. He was from one of the Swiss cantons where their native language is Latin, and so medieval Latin. And so he, really brilliant and sharp guy. So he collects a lot of info throughout that period, as long as he's in England. And so. Nevertheless, Henry had no idea about that, of course. And so if he did, he could have killed Fisher right away.
Yeah.
And so instead, they interrogate Fisher. He said, I know nothing about this. And he's kind of shocked at the whole notion of being a cardinal. He's like, this is never anything I would have sought or asked for. So, because in general, he had a fairly low opinion of cardinals. And it was, and not without reason. So, well, that didn't do anything. Like I said, Henry's retort is, well, let the Pope send his hat when he will. He'll have to wear it on his shoulders, though. So at this point, it's just Fisher and Moore is starting to gather more sympathy from the London crowds, which already hate Anne. So they need something, and they just don't have it. None of the interrogations, both of them will not answer anything that will, following in that principle in law, he who's silent seems to consent, but in their conscience, they're clear that they're not. And so they can't wiggle out of them anything they can use. So they have to get a newer, bigger law, a new act that has to be sworn, the Act of Royal Supremacy. And this is the big one, that any subject who will not swear that the king is the head of the Ecclesia Anglicana, the English church on earth, and condemn the Pope's pretended supremacy of the said church, then he shall be found guilty of maliciously intending treason against the monarch. It's thought crime. When you get down to it, it's thought crime. It is very much like today. You have to say this, or else you're a Nazi and you're going to be canceled. And what else is canceling someone besides the next step is killing them? You're on the exact same path to killing them when you cancel someone, when you close down all their bank accounts, when they're not allowed to have accounts and earn a living or get a job because they said something or some kind of wrong thing, right? That's the exact same thing as killing them. You just haven't gone to the step of putting them under the axe yet, or the gun or whatever. So for thought crime, and that's very much where we're at with the Act of Royal Supremacy. And so Henry's not only king over your bodies as far as being your king, but he's also the king of your souls. Is really what all these things come down to. And it's all done through Act of Parliament. Henry rules with Parliament and through Parliament. And so this is how it comes together. So even then, interrogation could not get anything out of the two. So then enter Richard Rich. And he goes to Fisher.
Richard Rich.
It's funny with Richard Rich. he survives the reign. He lives all the way into the 1560s. So he changes his religion as often as the monarch does. So he has, under Edward VI, he follows along with everything. Under Mary, he gets the biggest pair of rosary beads he can to show that he is, and it even starts informing on anyone, reporting them so they can be taken and burned. And like the bishops are like, no, we don't want to burn anyone else. We're tired of this. No, leave us alone. We're not going after some guy. You heard him say something, right? Then when Elizabeth becomes queen and you have the reimposition of the Act of Royal Supremacy, he swears it right away and goes back to being a Protestant, just like that. And ends up dying 1563 or 4, somewhere around there. But so that's Richard Rich. In the meantime, so he trips up Fisher with this whole thing. But the king's trusty messenger, he just wants to know, and it won't be used against you, I swear upon an oath. And once he swears an oath, Fisher's not streetwise to the new politics. Moore is. That's why Moore doesn't give him anything, but Fisher does. So Fisher admits it. Next day, Fisher's dragged in front of a trial. And the only evidence that's given against him is Richard Rich shows up. And that's who Cavendish identifies him as. Giving this story, said, well, you confessed to me maliciously against the king's supremacy. And he said, but you swore on an oath that the king merely wanted to know my opinion, that it wouldn't be held against me. And he said, what of it? And that's according to Cavendish, that it was probably there. So then Fisher is marched back with, and so on the way there, they have him, carried in a makeshift carriage, and the axeman showing with the axe facing outward. On the way back, it's facing toward Fisher as a sign that he's been condemned. So Fisher, gets the night, prays, and, the next day, prepares himself, has the warden wake him, and, wants him to get him some of his clothes so he can at least not be seen to shiver, lest people interpret that as him being fearful. And so then he reads his New Testament again, finds the line that inspires him, and then he goes out. And he gets to the scaffold, and they, tear away his clothes, and first he declares that he's dying for the unity of the Holy Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope, and that's why he's being put to death. And so they strip away his garments, and he looks like a skeleton. People are shocked. And that's why it was said shortly afterward, I can't remember who said it, that, if he had been in the kingdom of the Great Turk, in the Ottoman Empire, and had committed some great trespass there, that even then the Great Turk himself would have had pity upon him and at least sent him out of the kingdom rather than killing a man so old and frail. But not so our merciful king. So, the punishment for treason is being hanged, drawn, and quartered, but Henry had it commuted to a mere beheading. So Fisher asked all the people to pray for him and to pray for God to send the king a good word, or a good inspiration. I forget how it's written in the early biographer. And then he goes to the scaffold, and the axeman gets down on his knees and begs his forgiveness. And he said, "Nay, ask no forgiveness for doing your duty. Just be sure with the axe."
Now, is it true that the executioner did that with Thomas More as well, or was that borrowed from Fisher's account that they applied to More?
I don't remember that in the account of Moore's being put to death, but I do believe there was an exchange with the executioner where he did,
because it was certainly
ask forgiveness.
I don't recall if it's in the play version, but it's certainly in the film version.
Cavendish gives it for Fisher's execution. There is something with Moore's, but I can't remember what it is principally. So off the top of my head, but. So that's, Fisher's martyrdom. And then immediately they were ordered to bury his body in some unmarked spot so that way people couldn't go and collect relics. His head was taken and put on a spike in London Bridge. But then, Fisher never did any miracles in life. But in his death, he did a singular one, is that the smell of roses exuded. Now, his head is on London Bridge, okay? Now, London Bridge, far from what it is today, was a covered bridge with apartments and other things on it, houses for like merchant trade associations and things. Horses are going through there, animals are going through, animal carcasses. If you're butchering pigs in the city, your laws required you to go dump the parts you couldn't use outside of the city. Well, sometimes you'd give up and just dump it by the bridge. And so you've got horse poop, you've got dog poop, you've got human excrement, you've got the chamber pots being dumped down into the Thames. They hang on to the bridge. You've got, pig carcasses and chicken carcasses and the parts that couldn't be used sitting around at different places until the muckrakers come clean them up. And this is a stinky place. But for 2 weeks, people could only record the smell of roses and at London Bridge.
Wow.
And this was an extra humiliation for Henry, so he ordered Fisher's head to be cast into the Thames to make way for Mr. Moore's.
Wow.
Yeah.
So why is it then that what was it about Fisher specifically that was such an inspiration for all these other greats like Bellarmine and Borromeo and Alphonsus Ligurian, etc.?
He was a man who was driven by... So we can put it this way. There's three characters here in this drama, three major ones. You have Wolsey, you have Fisher, and you have Moore. And Wolsey was a king's man. And you see where that got him. Fisher was God's man, first and above all things. Moore tried as a layman, as a good layman should, to serve both, but with the proviso, just as Henry instructed him when he entered his service, to serve God first. So he was the king's servant, but God's first. Mm-hmm. But Fisher was the God's man, not the king's. And so he took his duty as a successor to the apostles with the utmost seriousness, to the fact that he was afraid about his own damnation if he just said, oh, well, we tried our best. Mm-hmm. He gave us all. He gave the model in terms of fasting and piety and so many things, that improving clerical discipline. His mildness and mercy with heretics, too, because you get heretics in his diocese, and he never burned a single heretic in his own diocese. He had a couple of cases, mostly Lollards. He always boasted...
Right, because he was more concerned with converting them, mm-hmm. right? Yeah.
He boasted that if any Lutheran should be in my diocese, either I shall make them a Catholic or they shall make me a Lutheran.
Yeah.
Right, and so he did consult in some other cases where people were put to death, but ultimately in his own diocese, where he had authority, nobody was ever executed for heresy ever. He gave some light, like if it was some layman that heard some nonsense, was reported to have said some nonsense, he would just make him do some extra prayers for a year and call it good. And there was not even heavy burdens or imprisonment of any sort or things like that. He's always concerned with his biggest thing was the salvation of souls. The early biographer records how, as a bishop, he would go into we'd hear people were dying. There's no priest at hand, and he himself would get on his horse and go. And he'd enter houses that were so smoky, none of his servants could abide them. But he would stay there until he had administered the last rites and given comfort to the dying.
Yeah, no, and I've heard that before. What exactly does that mean, that the house was so smoky?
So you'd have a chimney, or maybe you didn't have a chimney, but you got to have a fire. And so you might, crack a window. You expect that the thatch roof will let the smoke out, which it will eventually. But in the meantime, that smoke's going to billow in, and so you've got a fire that's always.
So you're basically just building a fire in your house without a chimney, and mm-hmm. just trying to let the smoke out the windows. So the smoke will go out through the thatch. If you had something a little stronger, you might have a chimney. Chimneys get blocked up, or they don't work efficiently, and so kind of the hovels that you might be able to develop for yourself. So the result is that you have to have fires burning. You'd have a big stew pot, and most of the time you're eating some kind of stew of something, barley, whatever. Every couple of weeks you might have meat, you might have some chicken. On very rare occasions you might have gotten some beef somehow, either as an alms or you might have been able to afford it, a little bit, and mixed it in with a lot of root vegetables, mm-hmm. right? And so so you always have to have that, and also for your laundry, you got to heat the water. So and that's why one of the jobs of women in those times is collecting firewood. Women and children, a lot of what you're doing, you're going to the commons, you're collecting firewood. Mm-hmm. But kindling and things just to keep the fire going, especially during winter. Yeah.
So you always got a thing going, and if you don't have an efficient way to get the smoke out, the place is always going to be somewhat smoky. And if you have a less efficient, either chimney or your thatch is too efficient or whatever, you're going to have more smoke than you probably should have. Probably another reason
it's not smoky because they're smoking cigars and pipes like that.
Exactly. Yeah, tobacco hadn't become a thing in England just yet. Even though it had been discovered, it was making its way in like Spain and France and whatnot. It still hadn't gotten to England. That would be... it would start making its way in, but it wouldn't get popularized until Sir Walter Raleigh, because of his connection with Elizabeth's court, would popularize tobacco, and he introduced it to Ireland, and that's how it became a thing in England. Some people did, but it just wasn't a thing yet until he did it. Now it had court patronage, and then you'd start smoking a pipe. Although it's interesting, what a lot of people in Elizabeth's court did with the pipe? They didn't smoke tobacco; they smoked sugar.
You know what? That's right. I do remember hearing that now.
Yes.
They smoked sugar.
Because
yeah.
sugar consumption was a sign of your wealth, and sugar was able to be acquired far more cheaply, whereas in the past it would have been incredibly expensive. It was coming from Arabia or something like that. Now it's coming from the New World through the Spanish, and so you can get it super cheap. Yeah. But now more and more people are eating sugar as a sign of their wealth, and you'd even make fake-looking meat that was actually sugar. All these weird psychotic things. And you look at the teeth of Black Plague victims, and they're like perfect teeth. Then you look at the teeth from skulls
royalty,
from around this time, from Elizabethan times and onward, and those teeth are horrible. They're
like
rotting.
Smoking heroin or crack.
I know, exactly. I'd be smoking sugar. Good grief. I don't want to know what that's like, actually. I'd rather not find out.
Jeez.
But anyway, so Fisher was steadfast in his mission to be a successor of the apostles and to be a true apostle for the people, and even to be a new John the Baptist, even when it was inconvenient. Yeah. I mean, he cared nothing for position or worldly glory. I mean, he's at the pinnacle of royal influence, really, as the Queen's chaplain. The only thing higher would have been being like an official position, like a chancellor or something. He's
confessor to the king himself.
Even that would be hugely powerful. And yet he's kind of excluded from court under Henry VIII. Doesn't care. Yeah, he's happier that way, and goes about his business as a bishop. And so he's asked to do things, even though he doesn't have royal favor and he's not going to get much thanks for it. He does it anyway for the sake of the church. He rises up against Luther and puts all of his learning to bear to write against the evils of Lutheranism. He goes to such great lengths for the unity in defense of the church, and is ready to give his life's blood for it. And like, even for just the one sacramental marriage between Henry and Catherine, like he said, I'm willing to lay down my life like a new John the Baptist. So Stephen Gardner, he comes back to the faith under Queen Mary, but he takes Henry's side right now during the time of the Legatine Inquest. So he makes a response to Fisher, and he says, is he suggesting that the king is like an impious Herod? Did you remember that line, about 7 years hence when you'll have Fisher beheaded? Yeah. And so, I mean, put on a spike, not for a dancing girl, but for...
Right.
Well, sort of for a dancing girl, namely for Anne Boleyn.
Well, yeah.
In this case. But anyway, so he was absolutely steadfast and fearless, in spite of his age, in spite of his health, in spite of what all these things meant. And
so, to wrap up then, what would you say are like some parallels we could draw between Fisher and his times in both church and state,
right,
as to be kind of examples and role models for our own times, for our own personal selves as laymen, but especially for bishops of our times?
The one of the greater evils, there were two very great evils afflicting the church in Fisher's time, as far as the hierarchy goes. One was, like I mentioned, episcopal absenteeism. You take your wage and you go live it up in Rome, or you go live at court looking for favors in either place and not doing your job. Two, the allowing and working with the encroachment of the state onto the church. So, and just allowing the state to have its way with the church and saying, well, separation of church and state, we can't say anything about these things. Now, granted, the world of Fisher is different than ours. The country is different. We have various traditions in America that don't allow for the church to be, making it. Although they do try to make impacts on policy when it's important to them, right? They write out these stupid statements about nuclear war and about gun control and about all these things, but they won't tell the government anything about abortion. No, that's every once in a while they might get out some statement, or even recently they're trying to say something and he got bishops. Oh, Bishop Strickland, you're so stupid for trying to have this statement to be pro-life. We're going to be marginalized. But they're perfectly happy marginalizing 50% of this country on things like gun control or but whatever the lefty cause they want to support. Being courageous for the church and for Christ, which is neither right nor left, but is in Christ's justice. And to stand up to the state encroachment on the church. Because what's going to happen, like I said, thought crime, just as the act of royal supremacy, now we're going to have it through, the woke agenda. And when I say woke, we got to be careful about how we define woke. We're not talking about something like the mere question of treating, people who are homosexual with human dignity, and not affronting or assaulting them. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking with a transgender ideology and everything, which is, I have so many things to say about that. But woke is using all our institutions, our media, our film, our storytelling, our church, to push this message, which the messaging, which is anti-human, anti-life, and the trans is just one little spoke in that wheel of the anti-life, anti-human agenda being ramrodded through by the state, being shown you have to be tolerant, and that is what bishops have to lay down their life, like a new John the Baptist, to fight against. This is what Fisher would have fought against. And you think, talking about the king's marriage to Catherine, how about any marriage, any Christian marriage, against the blight of divorce?
I mean, how many? Just look at our own country, let alone any of the other countries, but in our own country, how many bishops are standing up and openly correcting all these quote unquote Catholic politicians like Biden and Pelosi, etc.
Or now on the other side, Gingrich, or whatever. Go for it. any at all? No, none.
Yeah. I mean, you have some, like, a little bit, like from Cordeleon when he comes out with Pelosi, but for the most part, not much there. And especially with watch the language here. The demic pan of Vidco,
the unspecified virus of unspecified origin.
Worldwide, all the churches closed down. How many bishops no? Salvation of souls is my duty, and I'm gonna,
Now, on that one, I can forgive, like the closing and suspension of masses, just as a precaution when you didn't know specifically what you were dealing with. Yet at the same time, you still need to make, because and everyone says, "Oh, Borromeo closed the churches when there's big plague in Milan." Yes, he did. What else did he do? He got himself barefoot, leading a procession through the city every single day with the Blessed Sacrament. It employed all the armies of priests to go hearing confessions to any person begging, dying of last rites. The priests were scared. They were hiding in their basement. They wouldn't even go to the hospital to anoint someone. Of course, the hospitals wouldn't let them in, but they weren't even trying, many of them. Not all. There were certain heroic ones in there, but a lot of them, they weren't even trying, wouldn't hear confessions, and they basically, what you're doing when you do that is you're saying the temporal is higher than the spiritual. You're saying that your bodily health is more important than your spiritual health.
And that plague was far worse, where you in multiple of these
a third of his clergy died.
In multiple of these plagues throughout history, they're doing these processions through the streets, and people are, lots of people are dying in procession.
There used to be censures. You used to incur irregularity by fleeing your parish in a time of plague instead of ministering to the people. And so, I guarantee you, any plague that went on, I mean, you had plagues in England. The sweating sickness was one of the worst ones. John Fisher did not fail to minister to his flock whenever any plague came up. There were other bishops, they'd flee, like Richard Fox, the Bishop of Winchester, for a while. I mean, plague came up, he was gone, hiding away. Fisher was with the people.
Yeah.
You talk about the Holy Father, talks about whatever you think of him. He talks about, smelling like the sheep. So many of the people he surrounds himself with don't smell like the sheep. Fisher smelled like the sheep.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, is that, you have so many, and another thing too, you have so many things where you have your Episcopal conferences like the USCCB and their equivalents in other countries where they give statements and individual bishops hide behind that and don't actually do their job. And they don't really take it all that seriously. And Fisher did. But that's not unique to our times. That's, throughout the history of the church, most bishops have been mediocre, and then a large minority have been evil, and a smaller minority have been saints.
Yeah.
That's even during the time of the Fathers. I believe it's actually Peter Chrysologus, even though it's usually attributed to Chrysostom, that says that the way to hell is paved by the skulls of bishops.
Oh, I thought that was Bellarmine.
So no, he relates it though.
Okay.
But, in a letter, but it's actually
the road.
It's from the ancients though.
The road to hell is paved with priests with bishops as their signposts.
Something like that, yeah. All right, so I'm not familiar with that coming to view. I might not have read it in that way, but he says something similar in other places. But Peter Chrysologus says the path of hell is paved with the skulls of bishops, and that's what, the 5th century, right?
Yeah.
And so the 6th century, that was a problem back then. as it is now. I mean, that's just part of the mystery of iniquity working even in the church, is not everyone is going to live the dignity of their calling.
Right.
Fisher did. And that's why we need to look to that example. And he was not of any great nobility, not of any, superb wealth or anything, kind of, average middle-class family by our terms. And he was singularly brilliant, and he pursued God's call from an early age. There's not a lot in his early life. He gives references to certain things in his sermons that suggest what he must have been familiar with as a youth, but there's not a whole lot to know other than what like the early biographer gives, and he's writing in like 1550s. So it's probably drawing on testimony, but you can't be certain of it. So there's just not a lot there. But the path he chose in life, he must have had that singular vocation of holiness very early.
Yeah.
And following that, instead of looking at it, I can do that, but it's so hard. And then, there's so many other things we could talk about, but that's, and then for us too, following our path, following our vocation, our calling, whether we're talking about in a formal sense in terms of vocation of the priesthood, or in a small v, a colloquial sense of vocation in terms of doing what God wants you to do, sanctifying your family and your marriage, or yourself in whatever position you happen to be in, whatever, following that calling and pursuing it, not fearing it and falling away because it's too hard.
Yeah, and
because it is hard.
And I think also, especially in our day and time, like started off with this hyper attention to everything the Pope and bishops think, say, and do, and it's like so many people today are confused and like, what's going on with the church and and blah 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 blah. It's like, who cares? God is control of everything. Just focus on living your faith and doing your duty, and God will sort out the rest.
And Fisher,
because we don't. I mean, as lay people, we don't really have any influence. There's nothing we can really do to change the church other than sanctifying our lives and sanctifying our family and raising holy families that may then become priests and bishops and whatnot.
Right.
That's what we can do. Pray and do penance and raise holy families.
Especially for traditionalist Catholics. That's something that we really need to focus on, because where do most vocations, both for, say, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, or for the Society of St. Pius X, where do most of their vocations come from? It's people coming from the Novus Ordo that find tradition. That's the majority of their vocations. Fewer of their vocations come from traditional Catholic families.
Yeah.
Why is that? There's something where that traditional Catholics are not doing.
Yeah.
And that's something we should stop, and it goes for all of us. It goes for me.
Yeah.
That we need to stop and look at ourselves, and what kind of life are we giving our kids? Are we doing? And some of us are like, hey, I am doing my best, and that's fine. And that's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for you to answer out there. Am I doing my best?
Yeah.
And so, but obviously by the numbers, someone's not, and maybe that'll be me too. Maybe none of my kids have a vocation. Maybe my kids will not because of something I did. I don't know, and I have to examine myself and to look at that and see what can be done to help that along.
Yeah.
So but then on the other hand, don't be like, all right, you're going to be a priest. I'm going to make you
Oh,
a
sure,
priest.
yeah.
Don't do that either.
No.
Help them find their vocation.
Just teach them, like, pray to God so that you know what God wants you to do.
Right.
And then you do that. It reminds me too, with Fisher, I think it was St. John, not John of the Cross, but John of Avila, I think it was, who was also a doctor of the church and contemporary of John of the Cross. I think it was he who said that if priests fulfill only 1/3 of the duties of their state, they will be thought to be a saint. But if they fail to do the rest, they cannot hope to be saved, or something like that. Which is a very sobering thought.
Which should be terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I think
if I was a priest, I'd be terrified.
Yeah, and then that just, with John Fisher's quote, if I do not preach to the faithful, I'll be damned. Yeah. So
he said it in stark terms like that. And so, and you look at the people that made Fisher their model. So you look at St. Charles Borromeo. He gets to Milan. He has to fight Pope St. Pius V to actually take residence in Milan because Pius V wanted him there in Rome. And he said, no, I'm the Bishop of Milan. I need to... And no bishop had resided in Milan for 100 years. In the meantime, clerical life had devolved. There's ecclesiastical anarchy. There's a sense there's no authority. There's no one looking over to see what I'm doing. Priests become gangsters. They openly wear pistols and get into fights with people, kill people. They're not saying mass. They have concubines. The saying in Milan at the time was, if I remember it right, "Si vuole andare al inferno, essere un prete." If you want to go to hell, be a priest. That was the saying in Milan at the time when Borromeo took over. So he sent some Jesuit missionaries into the city to preach ahead of him. Again, back when that was a good thing. When it was Society of Jesus, not Society of Judas. But, and then he went in himself in procession with the cross. And of course, it's a huge destabilizing force to the status quo, because you have the Sforza, who used to run Milan, and their partisans. You have the Spanish, who technically were in charge of Milan. Philip II is technically the king of Milan, right? And so then you have, and the church has been a non-player. Now all of a sudden, Borromeo upsets the balance. So he's not only has recalcitrant and immoral clergy to deal with, he's also got the government and those who used to be in power that run all these various gangs and whatnot, that he's likewise got to deal with in order to get the city under control. His model is Fisher. He never wavers from what he was supposed to do at any moment. Not to say he didn't have faults in other places or things, but ultimately, really, his mission was clear to him. He did it. Bellarmine, and of course, again, Borromeo preaching all the time, because Fisher was a model for that. Bellarmine does the same thing when he comes to Bishop in Capua, is that it gets down to the custom generally had been you would get preaching in Advent and in Lent, and that was it. And it wouldn't be by the bishop, it would be by someone else. Bellarmine gets there, first thing he does is start preaching. And then people figure that, well, this is just a Lenten thing, right? Because he gets there during Lent. No, he preaches all year round, himself, in person, in the cathedral. And it was a shocking thing for the people there. And he did a lot and he just focused himself. I mean, he was embroiled in a big controversy, theological controversy, when he was in Rome, on De Auxiliis, that is, on efficacious grace. And one of the reasons that Clement made him a bishop was to kind of give a sign, you've got my disfavor, I want you out of here. He had no idea that Bellarmine hated being a cardinal, wanted out of there, and he was gone in 30 days, almost to the point of being impolite.
Wow.
And it was only at that point that Clement VIII discovered how much Bellarmine hated being a cardinal, because he went right to it and was not heard from again. Whatever that controversy was raging, he just went and put himself to the service of his diocese, endlessly, tirelessly. And so you look at any other bishop that took Fisher as a model, that's what they did. So, yeah, I would just appeal. I mean, bishops, I'm a trad. You get a lot of hate from trads. If you're a bishop and you're watching this, you do. And we could go into the reasons for it and why and the history of how traditionalists are mistreated. But justly or unjustly, you do get a lot of hate from trads. Mm-hmm. And so when trads make criticisms of bishops, then the bishops, well, you're like, well, why do I got to listen to these people? They're so rigid. They're so, they're such a pain. How about, let's try this. And granted, the Pope has tied your hands and made this very difficult. How about being pastoral? And not just to trads, too. Conservative Catholics, you're like, Bishop, we need this. Instead of listening to a small cadre, a very handful priests, boomer priests, and lay ladies in the chancery, why don't you spend time in your parishes talking to people? Spend time preaching and some of you do that. But how well? How many of you are really concerned? How many of you looked at what happened during COVID? And like I said, I give you a pass on certain things, closing the churches and whatnot. But now that we're here, when they come around for 2.0, are you going to put the temporal above the spiritual again? And are you doing that now in your episcopacy? And I want you to, and if you are, well, I'm not your judge, God is, but I think about it. Look at these great saints like Fisher. Look at these great saints, like Bellarmine, Liguori, whatever. Mm-hmm. Early church, Ambrose, Augustine, Peter Chrysologus, John Chrysostom. What they went through in order to preach against. I mean, you look at Chrysostom going against the government to preach the truth in major important things, which the trans mind virus is. And you can be accommodating to individuals who think they're trans and in such a way and pastoral them without compromising on the truth of men and women and human beings. And so don't give in to the woke mind virus, which is the new heresy of our times. It's a Marxist doctrine that is meant to ramrod through all this redefinition of what it is to even to be a human being. Yeah. It's just paving the way for transhumanism. So
So what's the title of the new book that you've got coming out again?
So there will be, at least by the time this airs, there will be a pre-order link at mediatrixpress.com. It'll be linked in the video here. So the title will be Against Martin Luther's Babylonian Captivity. I think that's what it is. I'd have to look at the draft title I've got, right? Because I try to simplify the very long Latin title. Against Luther's Babylonian Captivity by St. John Fisher. And I think it says in the top, in defense of the royal assertion, against Luther's Babylonian captivity. So there'll be the link there in the description. If it's not available by the time this airs, it'll be a pre-order, and we should be ready with it by about the new year.
And anyone interested in getting the biography of St. John Fisher by St. Vincent McNabb that I have here, that's already available. They can get that right now.
He should be, but
Father Vincent McNabb. Father Vincent McNabb.
And if it's in that, and so the biography by McNabb is a really wonderful read. It's short, and if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, it's a great book to buy. But if you're looking for something more in depth, more detail, there's another biography we have, St. John Fisher, humanist, reformer, martyr, and that is by E.E. Reynolds. And that is available also mediatrixpress.com. And it's a full, in-depth, and it's like a real biography, but written from a Catholic perspective. State papers, primary sources, and the actual Episcopal Register at Rochester. So many different things, and that's what the author has used to write the biography. And so it's not a mere hagiography. McNabb's is not a mere hagiography either, even though it's more in that tradition, but it works on the facts. This one's fuller, in-depth.
And that one is also currently available.
That's all currently available.
Okay. When is St. John Fisher's feast day?
So that's tricky because of the way they do it in the modern calendar. So in the older calendar, so he was martyred June 25th in 1536, and that is the feast day. Or not 1535, I said 36 again. My brain leapt a year. 1535. So June 25th is his feast day in the traditional calendar, and Moore's is on July 6th. In the 1970, in the Novus Ordo, they combine them. So now it's all on July 6th.
Okay.
Both saints.
Well, thank you, Ryan, very much for coming on the show and telling us about St. John Fisher. It's a fascinating saint, fascinating story, and I hope we can all learn a lot from him and enrich our lives by it. So, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.